Before we get started, I just wanted to remind you that starting in January of 2024, videos in this series are no longer going to be posted on Now Let's Be Honest. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start posting those videos on a different YouTube channel, which I just launched, which is just called by my name, David Tate. So if you're wanting some more laid back, informal, long form content like the stuff that you've been watching right here on this channel, you can go to that channel and subscribe to it there, because I'm going to try to keep this channel, Now Let's Be Honest, more focused on the stuff that I explicitly made for YouTube. So if you're here for this type of Bible study thing, go to that channel, subscribe to that. That's where this stuff is going to be starting in January of 2024. That being said, let's get to the stuff you're actually here for.
Father, you are the Prince of Peace. I pray that through all things, you would reconcile all of creation to yourself, and that there would be peace. When that day comes, we don't know, but I pray that in the meantime, we would stay faithful, that you would equip us to fight the good fight and not be overtaken by the evil one. Father, I pray that we would continue to live our lives in gratitude and of what you've done in the past, in the present, and will do in the future. That as we have been saved, that we continue to be saved, and that one day we shall be saved. And Father, as we go through your word tonight, let us not lean on our own understanding, but let us not be puffed up in knowledge, but rather let us be guided to truth and understanding by your Spirit. Your truth is what holds everything else together, and let that be the cornerstone of our faith. Father, it's in your name that we pray. Amen.
Amen. Also, I don't remember if I mentioned this before we prayed, but Sean is leading us tonight.
Oh.
Just an FYI. I don't know if I mentioned that, but yeah, Sean's leading us.
I was thinking that because he's
in the leading chair.
he calls it the leading chair.
This is the leading chair. Sorry, I realized I never mentioned that. Okay, sorry.
That's okay.
Yes, I did start recording. Thank you. Yes.
All right. Well, I might need y'all's help for context tonight. Because obviously we're not in 1 Kings 1 and also not in Genesis 1. So, I don't even know how you want to do this, but...
Up to you.
Hey Ben, would you like to recap just briefly, maybe like Genesis through 1 Kings?
I'll do my best. Well, there's this great big God who made the world, and he put man in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it. But being human like we are, we screw it up. We make bad decisions. Adam and Eve ate from the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, and ever since that time we've been prone to sin and doing our own thing. And God calls this man named Abraham to leave his land of Ur and go to a place that he doesn't know. And it takes a long time for this promise to come to fulfillment, that Israel will inherit this land. A man named Joshua, finally leads the people of Israel into promised land, and they're pretty faithful. But then during the period of the judges, they start falling back into sin, and they do horrible things. There's violence and wickedness, and then eventually the people of Israel want a king. So God gives them a king, even though they weren't supposed to have a king. And Saul, he's tall, dark, and handsome, and he's everything that the people want because he looks good. But God eventually rejects him because he's not doing what God wants him to do. So God calls David, a man after his own heart, and he's pretty much a good king, leads the people well, but even he falls into sin. He looks at a woman from a rooftop, and he sins, and he finally repents. But even through that, God is faithful to him, and then we come to 1 Kings.
Sweet. Okay, Brian, do you think you could do just pretty much 1 Kings 1 through 8.
Yep, yeah. So, beginning of Kings, we see that it's like getting to David's last days, and so he's giving Solomon like advice before he kind of like passes the torch, and he's telling him about different people that he needs to be weary of and all that type of stuff. So eventually, David passes away, and we see that God is with Solomon. They get to this conversation they end up having, and the big thing that Solomon asks for is that he asks God for wisdom, because he has this people in front of him, and he's like, I'm not worthy to lead your people. All I ask for is to have wisdom. And so God is really impressed by that, and he gives Solomon wisdom. He becomes, the wisest man in the world. And so then he starts to build the temple for God, and it's like this huge, big project with all this really expensive materials, and like everything is like lined in gold. And then we also talked about how the way that the temple looks, it gives like Garden of Eden imagery. And then it also is kind of structured in the same way of like a body, the way it's described, which there's like imagery that kind of goes with that. And then after they finish building all the temple and they explain the meaning of all the different parts, Solomon gets in front of like the entire people of Israel, and he dedicates the temple to God and has this really long, like beautiful prayer to God, and about how he's dedicating it to him and all that type of stuff.
Perfect. You want to add anything, David?
Not really. I mean, the one thing I guess I would highlight is, and we really emphasize this a lot over the last like 2 weeks that we've covered this, 1 Kings 8 is really like the pinnacle of Israelite history up until the modern day, right? Like 1 Kings chapter 8 is really in brief, is a picture of what Israel was supposed to be. Right, like it really is a good moment, and then sadly it's going to start going down. Like this is still a pretty good chapter, but the warnings that we're going to read about in this chapter foreshadow what's to come.
Yeah.
And really, 1 Kings 8, it's just a beautiful portrait of really like what it can look like for God's kingdom to come on earth as it is in heaven. Right, like it's just a really great portrait, which is going to make it more heartbreaking. But I think there's one thing I'd like to highlight because. I mean, really, the rest of like the things that we saw in chapter 8 are really like earth-shattering things, right? Like Deuteronomy chapter 12, God promised he would appoint a place where his name would dwell, right? David picked Jerusalem, but it wasn't until 1 Kings chapter 8 that God's name actually came to dwell there, right? And so Jerusalem is made significant because of this right here, right? 1 Kings chapter 8 is in many ways like is the fulfillment of many of the promises that God made to Abraham, right? The promises that God made to Moses. And like in a lot of ways, it is the culmination of so much biblical history right in that one chapter, which is why we spent 2 different weeks covering it. But I think, so I don't really have anything to add, narratively speaking, just to highlight the importance of that chapter. Like you really can't, I don't think, overemphasize how significant that one chapter was.
Yeah, I'd say so.
But it's going to make the rest of this really heartbreaking. Like, I hate it, like, especially because we've been going, like, we really started this whole journey with Judges.
Yeah.
And so, like, we went through a really dark spot. And then we came up and we, like, got through 1 Samuel and we got to 2 Samuel and we got those chapters of, like, David. And then it got rough again. And then, like, we got to, like, Solomon. We're like, all right, let's go. But unfortunately, it's going to go downhill, and it really isn't going to get better until, like, the New Testament, which is a long ways away. So it's gonna be pretty rough for a while.
Yeah.
So this is where the slippery slope begins.
Uh-oh.
Yeah.
We've yet to get to the divided kingdom.
Yep.
When Israel splits.
Yep. Okay. I guess we can go ahead and start going through.
Yep.
All right. Now it happened when King Solomon had completed building the house of Yahweh and the king's house and all that Solomon desired to do, that Yahweh appeared to Solomon a second time, as he appeared to him at Gibeon. And Yahweh said to him, I have heard your prayer and your supplication, which you have made before me. I have set apart as holy this house, which you have built by putting my name there forever, and my eyes and my heart will be there perpetually. As for you, if you will walk before me as your father David walked, in integrity of heart and uprightness, to do according to all that I have commanded you, and will keep my statutes and my judgments, then I will establish the throne of your kingdom over Israel forever, just as I promised to your father David, saying, You shall not have a man cut off from the throne of Israel. Alright, so what's going on here? Any thoughts?
I think it's cool that God shows up to him again. And I think the timing of it is probably pretty significant.
I agree.
Yeah.
I'll just go through verse by verse. Now it happened when Solomon had completed building the house of Yahweh and the king's house and all that Solomon desired to do, that Yahweh appeared to Solomon a second time, as he appeared to him at Gibeon. So what was the first time here?
That was what, 1 Kings chapter 3?
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Whenever Solomon asked for wisdom.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was after he had taken Pharaoh's daughter in marriage, and he went to Gibeon to sacrifice it. Like that was the greatest high place, because that was before the temple was built.
Yeah. So even that's kind of cool. Like just the how far we've come, right? I mean, he was at Gibeon, which was the greatest high place, and now here they are. I mean, this is what 20 years later,
Yeah.
right? He spent 7 years on the temple,
And then
13 years on his house. So this is like 20 years later, and in those 20 years, like he's not. This isn't Gibeon anymore, right? This is like, Jerusalem. God's presence is now dwelling. Like that's kind of cool.
In the temple.
Yeah, I agree. Anything else there?
In those 2 verses.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of stuff. I don't want to do all the talking though. So I give other people a chance to talk before I go on my long spiels.
We kind of highlighted it before, but it's cool how it's like referring to Solomon as like king, and how it puts like has completed building the house of Yahweh first and the king's house. It's like it comes secondary. It's like the most important thing, the house of Yahweh, the temple has been built, and then it's like, oh yeah, and we built Solomon's house too. It's just the king's house though, because like the ultimate king is God, and so I think that's kind of cool. Just like the order that is, it's Yahweh, and then it's the king house. And all that Solomon desired to do is after. It's like not an afterthought, but it shows the priority, I guess. I think that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
I think the timing of this is significant. I already mentioned that a second ago. Sorry, I'm also trying to read through this like commentary thing as we're going through it to see if there's anything significant worth highlighting.
Yeah.
But that's not what I'm talking about right now. The timing of this, like let's think through this, right? Obviously, the text doesn't explain to us why God showed up at this point. But if you're just thinking through this logically speaking, why do you think it is that God chooses to appear to Solomon here? Why does he wait until after it's all done?
Why does he wait until after like the prayer and all that stuff? Is that what
Well, this isn't just after the prayer. This is after everything's been completed, right? So this is after, it emphasizes, now it happened that when Solomon had completed the building, the house of Yahweh, and the king's house, and all that he desired to do, right? So Solomon has completed all of the things he wants to do, then Yahweh appears to him a second time, as he had appeared at Gibeon.
I'm thinking that God's wanting to warn him of like, you made all this for me. Don't let it take your heart away from me.
Yeah.
Don't let it cause pride to well up within you.
Okay.
That's what I'm thinking. Saying.
I would
Well-
say, go ahead.
No, good.
I would say that maybe he wanted to see Solomon like complete what he was going to do, like not come in halfway and try and not put ideas in his head, but like wait till Solomon completes everything, and when he comes at the end, it would be kind of like a seal of approval, kind of like
Okay.
God showing that like he sees what Solomon did and that he's kind of like blessing it because he kind of like asked for blessings for it. He's done this for him, and then Yahweh appears to him, and he's like, yes, I like this. This is pleasing to me.
Mhm.
But to come like halfway through, maybe it wouldn't like be as significant. I mean, it would be significant, but maybe,
Yeah. What were you going to say?
That's what I was gonna say. Just basically a seal of approval. It's like,
Yeah.
I mean, after building a house for him and then also dedicating it to him, I feel like it makes sense that he should respond after that.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
like, it's him answering his prayer. And
Well,
being like,
that's one thing he's going to say, I have heard.
yeah. So
Yeah.
it's really him like answering like, I have heard and seen what you've done.
Yeah. Yeah. And like to me, like I agree with all those things. I think there's probably multiple reasons behind this, right? Another reason that I would think is first off, like the author goes out of his way to highlight the parallel, right? I mean, first off, it's cool that God appeared to Solomon once, but then God appears to him twice. I mean, that's really neat, right? Especially because this is kind of unique. Like David really didn't have any encounters like this with God. You know, like all of David's interactions with God were primarily through like a middleman, but it seems like God is appearing to him almost like how he appeared to like Abraham and stuff in the past, right? Which is really cool. But the author goes out of his way to highlight that, like he highlights the connection between this account and the account in Gibeon, right? He could just say, and God appeared to him, but he says, this is the second time, just like before, which means that you're supposed to have that account in mind when you read this. And so that would lead me to think, well, okay, what happened in the first account? Well, God asked him, what do you want? And Solomon responded, I want a hearing heart, which is interesting because God says, I have heard your prayer, right? It's the same verb, Shema, right? So there's that parallel. So it's like Solomon asked to be able to hear, and he asked for wisdom, and God is now hearing Solomon. But I would actually argue that, and this leads to the second thing that really I think that God's purpose is here. I would argue that that same question that he asks Solomon at the beginning is lingering in this account as well, right? So in the first account, he asks Solomon, like, ask anything of me and I'll give it to you, right? So really the big question is, what do you want? I think that's actually the lingering question that God is asking Solomon here as well, right? Because he's going to warn Solomon and he's going to say, hey, if you don't follow me, this is what's going to happen. If you do follow me, this is what's going to happen, right? I think that really, now that Solomon has done all these things and he's had all these accomplishments, he's going to ask him, all right, you've accomplished this stuff. You've started well. Are you going to finish well? Right? I think that's a big question about this. And I think the reason why it emphasizes like Solomon completed building the house. He built the king's house. And he did all that he desired to do. Right? It's the idea that Solomon, kind of like following in the path of God, right? He has completed his 6 days of creation. Right? Well, what did God do on the seventh day?
He rested.
God rested. And so Solomon has completed all he desired to do. He has looked at it. He has said it is very good. And so now what period is Solomon entering into? Rest. Which is a dangerous place to be as a human. Right? Usually we are very good at being faithful to God if we have a clear task ahead of us. Right? Whenever David is on the run and he is trying to fight for his life and he's trying to take care of the people, he is faithful. What is it that led David into sin?
Whenever he was just chilling at the palace.
When he desired to chill at the palace and rest. Right? That's usually when we fall into sin as well. Right? It's whenever we get into those periods of rest, because as we see, we don't handle rest really well, which is why God gives so many commands about how they should handle the Sabbath day. Right? Because it's like, okay, it's a day of rest, but here's what I mean by rest. Right? It is not rest in the sense of lethargy and treat yourself. It is rest in the sense of I want you to enjoy it and trust me. Right? So there's a distinction there. Right? So, like, the theme of rest is a huge thing throughout the Bible, and I think what we see is that people don't handle rest well, right? They rest oftentimes in ways that serve themselves rather than allowing God to serve them through that rest. I think that's why God shows up here, right? Because Solomon didn't need this warning whenever he had a clear task ahead of him. But now Solomon has accomplished what was really his life goal, right? Like, really, Solomon's claim to fame is seeing Israel to its prosperity and building a temple. Well, he has seen Israel to its prosperity and he's built a temple. Solomon has done the things that he is known for. Now that he has reached that goal, the question is, what are you going to do with the rest of your life? And so I think that's why God shows up here, right? Because this is where Solomon needs the warning, right? He didn't need it when he was building the temple because he had a clear goal. He was like, this is what I need to do. This is what God's called me to do. I'm going to do this. Well, now he has prayed the prayer. God's presence is dwelling in the temple. Everything is going perfectly fine. And this is where he's going to look out at his creation and temptation is going to rise up. I think that's why God shows up right here. Right? And so really it's that same question. What do you want? Back whenever you were getting started as a king, you wanted a hearing heart to govern the people wisely. I gave you that, and now you're at the top of the world. do you still want the same thing? Because if you don't, then all the things I gave you could lead to your destruction. And I think, sadly, that's going to be the tragic story here. Because Solomon's wants are going to change, right? So, like to me, that's really what seems to be going on here. I think that's why God shows up. And once again, I'm not going to ascribe those motives to God, but I think that seems to kind of be the implication.
Yeah, makes sense for sure.
Yeah, so.
It also reminds me of God gives us what we want. We should still follow Him and seek to do His will, and not let what He's given us consume us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and I just wanted to check. The word for completed there in verse 1 is the same word that you read in chapter 2 of Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
Thus the heavens and the earth were completed, all their hosts, and on the seventh day God completed His work, which He had done. Right, it's the same word. I just wanted to check because I was pretty confident it was. But that is the same word there. So
It makes sense. Okay, we'll read on. And Yahweh said to him, I have heard your prayer and your supplication, which you have made before me. I have set apart as holy this house, which you have built by putting my name there forever, and my eyes and my heart will be there perpetually. So what's God saying there?
He's heard him,
Mm-hmm.
first off.
He approves what He's done.
And what prayer is this referring to?
The one we read in chapter 8.
Yeah.
I think that's so cool.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, imagine God showing up to you and saying that He heard your prayer, which is what Solomon asked, right? Solomon said, like, lend your ear to me, basically,
Yeah.
right? But that's so cool. I mean, like, to have, I mean, obviously God hears all of our prayers, but to have God literally be like, I have heard your prayer. And specifically, that's the Hebrew word Shema, which, you know, in Hebrew, like, Shema isn't just going in one ear and out the other. It implies obedience, right? To Shema is better than to sacrifice, to hear or to obey, right? And so it's not just, yes, I received it. It's saying, I have heard it and I'm going to act based upon it. Like, it's pretty cool, if I may say so myself.
So that's the first half of the verse. What about the second half?
Also, just the word before me, like the phrase before me, in Hebrew, that's before my face. I
yeah.
I wish we translated it that way in English. Like, almost every time that's what it is. But for some reason, they don't translate it that way, even though I think it's kind of essential, right? Like, I know that it doesn't sound natural to us, but like...
I guess semantically, it's like technically the same thing, but...
Yeah, like, but to me, I think it's significant. Like, you prayed it before my face, right? It's not simply like, oh, it's just, you prayed it to me. No, the idea is, the temple is His dwelling place. You prayed it in my direction. You prayed it to my face, right? It's really not that significant. It's just something that I wish we translated it differently.
No, I agree.
That's still the first half of the verse, but yeah, sorry. I have set apart as holy this house, which you have built, by putting my name there forever, and my eyes and my heart will be there perpetually. That's cool. The phrase, by putting my name there, in Hebrew, I've got it pulled up. It's a triple pun.
Really?
Yes. It's, let's see, it's Leshum Shemi Sham. Yeah, so it's the shm, yeah, Leshum Shemi Sham. Leshum Shemi Sham. Like, that's so fun. Like, I think that's a really fun thing. Yeah. Just stuff like that. But I think that that's significant, right? This is one of those things where I try to highlight Hebrew stuff, because in English, we get the point, but every time there's wordplay in Hebrew, it usually implies it's a phrase that the author wants the people to remember, right? Because it rolls off the tongue. Leshum Shemi Sham, right? By putting my name there. That's what that phrase is. Putting, Leshum, my name, that's Shem, right? Well, my name is Shmi, right? And then Sham, there, right? Leshum Shemi Sham. By putting my name there. I just think that's like, the author is highlighting that phrase. Because it's kind of cool. Like, God's presence is dwelling there, and then the word after that is forever, right? I'm assuming it's la'olam.
I would assume so.
Oh, it's ad olam, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Cool.
And the fact that it says like his eyes and his heart will be there perpetually. Like it's not just his name, but it's like, I mean, it's his eyes and his heart. So it's like,
Yeah, what do you think he means by that?
yeah.
Perpetually?
No, my eyes and my heart. What does he mean? Does he mean that he like literally plucked out his eyeballs and threw them into Jerusalem?
Nope. He sees him, and his heart is with him forever.
Where at?
In the temple. I believe it's in the temple. His house.
Yeah. Yeah, I have set apart as holy this house which you have built by putting my name there forever. It's interesting because the house itself is going to be destroyed, but where he built the house is the place where his name is going to dwell forever, right? Specifically in Jerusalem, right? So the house might come and go, but the house Solomon built, he built it there in the place where he's putting his name forever, right? And Solomon talked about that in chapter 8, right? Where like God chose Jerusalem because David chose Jerusalem, which is still super cool. My eyes and my heart will be there. I think it's not just talking about just the house. I think it's talking about where the house is at, right?
Yeah, that makes more sense.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about like the imagery of like his eyes are being like on Jerusalem.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
it's like he's like always looking to it. And I guess like heart, it's like, I mean, I guess we kind of use the phrase like my heart is like with like these people
Yeah.
or something. Is that the same kind of?
Yeah, I was actually talking about with my students with this because we were in Deuteronomy 6 today, talking about like the Shema, right? And it says, "Ve'avachata Yahweh Eloheka bekol lehavaka, levavaka," right? You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart. And we were talking about the word levav, right? The word for heart. And it's cool because the way that Jewish people use the word heart is kind of similar to how we use it, because I mean, it's still a little bit more than how we use it, but the way we use heart has probably been influenced a lot by just Christian readings of it, because we talk about, like, whenever we celebrate Valentine's Day, we, like, you know, give people boxes with chocolate, like in chocolate hearts and stuff like that, right? And the reason why is we closely associate heart with love, even though we know that that's not where love actually comes from, right? Like, love, I mean, that's like more of like a brain thing. We don't give people boxes of chocolate brains, right? We don't do that, right?
Chocolate brains.
But the reason why we really associate the heart with love is because your heart starts beating faster. Like, you feel love in the heart, right? And so I think in that way, the Jewish understanding of heart is very similar, because it's something more than just like the organ.
Yeah.
But it goes beyond that as well, because really the Jewish idea of heart, it goes beyond just feelings. It's more like all that you are. Right, like the heart is the root of who you are. It's like it's the core of who you are as a person, right? It is the thing that like it is where all of your decisions come from, your desires come from. It is the root of your will, right? Like that's what a heart is. And so whenever it says you shall love the Lord God with all of your heart, it's saying you shall love Him with all that you are. I think God's saying that here, right? My eyes are always looking to Jerusalem, and my heart will always be there, right? All that I am. That's my throne, right? I think that's what he's really saying. Like, this is my place. My heart goes there, but you get the idea, like in English, like the same way where we say, like, my heart goes out to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Like, even right now, with the stuff going on in Israel and Gaza, like we say, my heart goes out to the Israeli people. I think that like the way that we use that is the same implication, right? So that's one of those places where it kind of just it works out. But if anything, it's even stronger than how we usually use it. I could talk about heart a lot. I can talk about all this stuff a lot, but yeah.
All the Bible.
I don't even know if I should. It's just kind of funny. Like technically, like when it says like he's gonna put his name there forever. It's like, I mean, don't we sometimes like call Jesus like the name, like the name of the Lord?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's like he literally will be there forever.
He will. Yes.
I don't think that's what you're supposed to get out of it, but I think it's funny.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, no, like, because we've talked about how, like, in the Old Testament specifically, like, whenever we just, like, kind of break down, like, systematic theology stuff, usually the phrase, the name of Yahweh, is most closely associated with the second person of the Trinity, which would be Jesus.
Yeah.
And so, Jesus will reign there literally forever. But then some people even they mention the fact that this is something that Jewish people like to bring up a lot. I don't know. I think this is reading too much into it, but they'll point out the fact that if you actually look at the structure of Jerusalem, like just like the layout, the topography of Jerusalem, it's situated around three valleys that make the letter, like
The shin.
the shin. Yeah, it makes the Hebrew letter shin. Like if you look at it, which they would associate with the name El Shaddai, or even Hashem, right? The name.
Yeah.
Like the letter Shin is the first letter there. And so they'll say that God has literally stamped his name on Jerusalem. I think that might be reading too much into it, but
It's kind of cool.
it works, right? So I just think that's, there's a lot of different ways you can interpret this, right? But yes, his name will be there forever. He has literally stamped it there forever. And his eyes and his heart will be there perpetually, like in an ongoing manner.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, especially because the author's writing this at a time period when he knows that the people have gone into exile,
Yeah.
right? Which is really neat, right? Because that implies that even though the people have left, I mean, I think there's a reason the author highlights this phrase. Because he's writing to people who are in exile, and he's reminding them that all because they're in exile does not mean that God has abandoned this, right? Unless the author's trying to argue that God's a liar. But I don't think that's what the author's doing.
Yeah.
I think he's pointing out, you might be in exile, but God's eyes are still on Jerusalem. His heart is still on Jerusalem. It's still there perpetually. You might be gone, but that doesn't mean God's abandoned his promises. I just think that's like probably like a thing that the original audience would have gotten out of this that we kind of might overlook sometimes.
Yeah. No, that definitely makes sense.
And to go back to like talking about like Jesus and stuff like that, it's kind of cool because God is talking to Solomon, and Jesus will come from his line. You know, like he comes from the line of David, so he comes from the line of Solomon. That's kind of cool too.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah, and also just the word house there. We've seen this in Samuel. Sometimes the word house is played fast and loose with, to where sometimes it can refer to the temple, but it sometimes can refer to like the house of David, right? And so he's going to build the temple, but he's also going to be with the house of David perpetually. And eventually, in Jesus, the houses are going to merge to where the temple and the house of David are going to become the same thing,
Yeah.
which is kind of cool, if you think about it. So,
Yeah, that's true.
yeah.
Yeah. And I guess it also kind of ties in with the next verse, or like the next few verses too. If we're talking about like his eyes and his heart being like looking upon Solomon and people, I guess it kind of follows that the next like that's the next thing he would say. But we'll keep reading. As for you, if you walk before me as your father David walked, in integrity of heart and uprightness, to do according to all that I have commanded you, and will keep my statutes and my judgments, then I will establish the throne of your kingdom over Israel forever, just as I promised to your father David, saying, you shall not have a man cut off from the throne of Israel.
That is a big old if.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, no
If
kidding.
you will walk before me.
I think a lot of this first half of this chapter it's really like the same things repeated many times over for a reason, of course. But like this would call back to, I guess it's really called back as far as the Davidic, like what, Second Samuel 7.
Yeah.
And as we talked about before, it's like, note that it is a conditional covenant. It's not unconditional.
Yeah.
And so, like, it's not here, but I guess the next slide there will be a but if not.
Yeah. I think it's especially interesting that he says this because Solomon literally ended his prayer last week by articulating the same stuff.
Yeah.
Right? Like he was saying, like, if we are faithful to you, be with us, and if we're not, depart from us. And it's almost like God is showing up here and he says, Solomon, that doesn't just apply to the future generations. I'm speaking to you. Right? Like this, like you need, like, I know that you prayed it and I know that you know it theologically in here, but this is a warning to you.
And there's also the, like, again, it's not in there, but there's also, like, considering all that he has done, I feel like there could also be the sense of, like, this spiritual high that could be following having done all these things. And So I don't necessarily know that's why God's saying this to him, because there's probably multiple reasons, but there is also the warning just because it might be tempting to, after being, so good for such a long time, it might be easy to
Let your guard down.
let your guard down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because, surely the person who built the house of Yahweh would never,
Yeah.
Well, especially when they're doing, he just made a huge accomplishment. Nothing else in history has been for the people of Israel has happened. That's other than the Exodus, but doing something for God this big has not happened. This is a momentous occasion, building this huge temple. So it's probably easy for Solomon to get in his head and be oh, well, I'm the king, and this huge temple was built for God under my reign, to where I feel that's probably a sobering moment for him to hear that from God, because he just built this huge temple for him. So
Are you kidding me? I preach a sermon and one person tells me good job, and all of a sudden my next 5 sermons are ruined because I'm I crushed it. And then I'm just cocky, and it's yeah, that's after preaching one mediocre sermon and a person compliments me.
yeah.
Imagine building the place where God will dwell forever.
Yeah.
And God's presence comes to dwell there, and God says, I heard your prayer. Solomon's probably coming off the biggest spiritual high ever.
Yeah. Not only did he do something for God, but then in his head he's probably well, I turned to all of Israel, I turned all of their eyes. He just led this big prayer in front of all of Israel, and he's I just turned all their eyes to God. So it's not only am I doing something specifically just for God, but I'm ministering to all these people in a really good way. Now they're going to be spiritual, and so it's in 2 ways.
This is almost like the sin is crouching at your door moment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? Sin is crouching at your door. You must rule over it.
Yeah.
Right? That's kind of where we're at here.
Yeah. And and ironically for the exact opposite reason, because the thing is with Cain, the whole point of the whole thing is that he was downcast because God did not look upon what he offered him.
Yeah.
Solomon basically offered God what every Israelite wishes they could do.
Yeah.
But for the exact same reason, God will still tell him, hey, sin's crouching at your door.
Yes.
You did this amazing thing. You prayed a really good prayer, but that's not, it doesn't end there.
Yeah. To hear is better than to sacrifice. Right? It's not just the temple is not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for your heart. Yeah. As for you, if you will walk before my face, same thing. Before my face. There's a difference there. That's why I wish we translated it differently. It's not just walk before me. Walk before me almost implies God's walking here and Solomon's walking out there. No, it's God is looking at him and he says, I'm watching you. Be careful with your walk. Walk before my face. Right? I'm watching your every step. Be careful. I got a question for y'all. As for you, if you walk before me as your father David walked, in integrity of heart and uprightness, question, how can this be said? Because earlier, whenever Benjamin was talking about David, he mentioned that David was not a very upright person sometimes. And we've already talked about this. David didn't handle rest very well, did he?
Yep.
So how can God say, if you will walk before me as your father David walked, in integrity of heart?
Because he repented. He was obedient in the fact that after he sinned, yes, it was a while before he repented, but when Nathan the prophet came to him, he's oh, I've sinned against the Lord, and I need to repent.
I think there's an element of that. But still, is that integrity of heart and uprightness?
Well, I think that it comes from the same perspective of whenever you're reading First and Second. Well, I think it's the Second Samuel too, but especially in First Samuel, when we first hear about David, we haven't even met him yet. We just know that he's a man after God's own heart. Whoever the author was that wrote that, he wrote that way after David did that sin. So if the statement is true that David is a man after God's own heart before we ever meet him, then therefore we know that David walked with integrity of heart and uprightness, because both of those statements kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah. So let me get you thinking about this in a slightly different way. Integrity of heart. Let's take this out of theology for a second. Let's imagine this. Imagine you encountered this phrase in any other book, right? And it wasn't in reference to God. What type of context do you think the phrase integrity of heart would be used in? What type of relationship?
I'm guessing marriage.
Probably marriage, right? In which case, what would integrity of heart mean?
Oh, being faithful to your spouse.
Probably being faithful to a spouse.
Yep.
right? So I don't think,
I see.
whenever God's talking here, I don't think that he's saying that David is perfect.
Yeah.
Yep.
What is he saying that David never did?
He's saying that his eyes were only on God. He had no other gods before.
Yes, that's the main thing. You have to realize this, because like I emphasize this, because this is going to shape how you read the rest of 1st and 2nd Kings. Because this is not the only time that God's going to call back to David. He's going to mention David throughout the rest of 1st and 2nd Kings. And the narrator's going to highlight it. Yeah.
Every king.
Yeah, every king, they're going to say he either lived up to David's standard or did not live up to David's standard. They're not saying that David was perfect.
Yep.
David messed up a lot. The main thing that David has to his credit is that he never turned to idolatry. Right? David might have done a lot of messed up stuff, but he never looked left or right. Right? God was the only God he served. Right? This is kind of like in a marriage. Right? It's one thing, like you don't expect your spouse to be perfect. Right? Your spouse is going to mess up here and there. Maybe they'll lose their temper every now and then. But the main thing that's a make or break thing is, are they checking out other women? Are they checking out other dudes? Right? That's the main thing. Right? You're not going into it expecting your spouse to be perfect. You're going to be gracious with them. The main issue is, are they faithful to you? That, I think, is what God chiefly has in mind. Right? Which is really cool, because that's what he's asking of Solomon here. Right? And that's really encouraging for us as well, application-wise. God doesn't expect perfection.
That's right.
Does that mean that we shouldn't give him as much as we can? No, we should. He's given us commands for a reason. And usually the other things that we do flow out of our integrity of heart. But that's what he specifically has in mind. David walked in integrity of heart and uprightness in the sense of he never looked at Dagon. He never looked at Baal. He never looked at Ashtaroth. He never looked at Ra. He never looked at Zeus. He never looked at Ares. He only had eyes for Yahweh. Right? That was David's whole thing. I think that is what he's warning Solomon about, because also he knows that's what Solomon is going to succumb to. Right? I just wanted to highlight that because this is the first time we really see that phrase show up, but it's going to become increasingly prominent throughout the rest of Kings, and so we kind of needed to address that.
Yeah,
Right.
that makes sense. And I think later on he actually brings that very thing up.
Yes.
Yeah.
He'll elaborate on it later on in this chapter.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. I'm gonna add that I love that that integrity of heart. I love it.
Yeah.
And then you also have to do according to all that I've commanded you and to keep my statutes and my judgments. What do you think he probably has in mind there?
The law.
The law, right? And so those are things that David strove to obey, right? David's failures were he departed from the law, but like really these are the two things that go hand in hand. David never abandoned the law altogether, right? He didn't just go and say, you know what, forget the law. No, David messed up and he broke the law. That's a different thing, right? But it's not like he was like, we don't need the law.
Yeah.
No, he was like, no, the law was given to us by God to be followed. And whenever he was called out on it, he was just. And he said, I deserve to die, right? And he understood, like, the nature of the law, right? I think that's really the main thing. Be faithful to Yahweh, follow his law, right? I think that's really the two components that he's emphasizing to Solomon here.
Yeah. That makes sense. And then verse 5. Then I will establish the throne of your kingdom over Israel forever, just as I promised to your father David, saying, you shall not have a man cut off from the throne of Israel. And so what does that call back to?
What was it, the Davidic covenant?
Yeah. So it's pretty much just a continuation of that, because it still applies to Solomon.
So the word to establish there, it means to rise up. I will literally cause it to rise. Right? I will make my covenant established. It will be raised up. The main reason I highlight that is the first time the word ever shows up is in Genesis chapter 4 with Cain and Abel, where it says Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and killed him.
Oh, really?
Cain established. He literally got up and killed his brother. So it's almost like a reverse. Like if we're looking at the parallels, it's literally a reversal, right? Where Cain rose up and killed his brother. If Solomon doesn't do that, then God will rise up the covenant, right? And then when you go Genesis chapter 6, God says, I will establish my covenant with Noah. Chapter 9, I will establish my covenant with Noah. Chapter 13, he tells Abraham to arise and walk throughout the land. Chapter 17, I will establish my covenant with Abraham. Right? I was just trying to look that up. just to see where it showed up. But it literally means to just rise up. But
Interesting.
yeah, not super significant. I just thought it was funny that it happened to show up in Cain and Abel's story, which we were literally just talking about. But
Yeah, that is funny.
I will establish the throne of your kingdom over Israel forever. This is so disappointing, though. Because, I mean, it's really cool that he made this promise, but it's so sad whenever you know where this is going, right? It shows us that, once again, it's not unconditional, right? It's, if you do these things, then you will not have a person cut off from the throne. But he's not going to do it. But the cool thing is that all because a man is cut off from the throne doesn't mean that he's abandoning his promise to David.
Yeah.
Right? It just means that you might not have a person sitting on the throne of David. But that doesn't mean he's abandoning David altogether. Right? Because he's already said, I'm going to dwell here forever. Right? So somehow those two things are going to have to go hand in hand. Somehow the kingdom is going to exist even if there isn't a king on the throne continually.
Right, because it doesn't say, like, I forget what he said, was it Eli? About, like, his house being, like, I don't know if it was that it was cut off, but he basically said, like, his house was going to end.
Yes.
That's not what he's saying here.
Yeah.
That's a different phrase.
One of the reasons why that happened is because Eli wasn't a good father to his sons Hophni and Phinehas.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, they were wicked. He didn't discipline them. And it shows you it's important, right? Okay, we'll keep going on.
Yeah.
But if you or your sons indeed turn away from following me, and do not keep my commandments and my statutes, which I have given before you, and go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land which I have given them, and the house which I have set apart as holy for my name, I will cast out of my presence. So Israel will become a proverb and a byword among all peoples, and this house will become a heap of ruins. Everyone who passes by will feel desolate, and hiss and say, why has Yahweh done thus to this land and to this house? And they will say, because they forsook Yahweh their God, who brought their fathers out of the land of Egypt, and took hold of other gods and worshipped them and served them. Therefore Yahweh has brought all this calamity on them.
Ouch.
I think it's interesting how there's like more parameters about the negative things that will happen versus like the description earlier. It was so much shorter about like the positive things will happen because God probably knows that we're probably gonna go the other way.
Yeah.
So he gives, I guess, more details.
Yeah. You don't need as many details to persuade Solomon to be faithful. More so, you need more to push him towards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can see why whenever the people come up to Jesus and ask him what the most important commandment is, he emphasizes, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Right? The Shema. Right? Because that's really what this is. Right? It's about, will you be faithful to God or not? Right? Shema Yisrael, Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad. Right? Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. Right? Yahweh's our God, nobody else. Yahweh alone is our God, nobody else. Right? Like that is the emphasis. And right here in verse 6, his whole thing is, if you don't keep my statutes and my commandments, which I have given you, and go and serve other gods. So he summarizes all the commandments and statutes by saying that it involves being faithful to me. Right? Like he literally says, if you're not obeying my statutes and commandments, that implies you're going to worship other gods.
Yeah.
Which means that all 613 commandments of the law can be summarized in Yahweh is our God, Yahweh alone, love Yahweh with all that you are. Right? Like that's what he's saying. Right? If you're not obeying the commandments and statutes, you must be going to serve other gods. Because, like, I don't know, I just think that's interesting. Like, you get how Jesus arrives at that answer. Because that seems to be how God is interpreting the law. Right? He's like, yeah. Like, it's, I don't know. I just think that's kind of cool.
No, that definitely makes sense. I feel like a lot of this, like, I think the kind of the middle part, I mean, I guess we'll go through it, but, like, it almost sounds half prophetic, but it also feel like it kind of calls, some of the stuff calls back to stuff we talked about before, and like I said, it calls to the future as well. we'll go ahead and go through verse by verse. But if you or your sons indeed turn away from following me and do not keep my commandments and my statutes, which I have given before you, and go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land which I have given them, and the house which I have set apart as holy for my name, I will cast out of my presence. So I guess one thing I would note there is like recognizing who's actually doing the cutting off and the casting out. Because he doesn't really say like if you don't listen to if you don't do these things like other people are going to. He specifically credits himself with like being the one to cut off Israel from the land and to cast the house out of his presence.
Yeah.
Which I think is important.
Which once again makes sense whenever people ask Jesus about marriage. The one reason he says divorce is allowed. Sexual immorality, right? Adultery. If you're unfaithful, that is the cause for divorce. Well, that's what God is saying here, right? If you are not faithful to me, I will cut you off. I'll divorce you. I'll kick you out. Metaphorically speaking, God has planted a new Garden of Eden, right? The land of Israel is the land flowing with milk and honey. Jerusalem is the place where God dwells. And he says, if you break this covenant with me, I will kick you out just like I kicked Adam and Eve out. Right? I will send you out of Eden and you'll go away. And I'll break up with you just like I broke up with them. That's kind of what he's saying. I mean, once again, you have to read that in light of the fact that he made an unconditional promise to Abraham and an unconditional covenant to David. Right? So he's going to cut them off from the land, but that doesn't imply that he is totally abandoning his covenants. Right? So you have to read what he's saying here in light of what he said previously. But it seems like it's the same imagery.
Yeah, and it's not like the same exact imagery, but it kind of calls back to like the whole like Exodus 32, 34. Mm-hmm. Is that like, I guess the way that I would then read that is that God doesn't seem to think, like, obviously the house and the land is important, but it's not, how do I put this? He doesn't need the land, he doesn't need the house to fulfill his promises. And it was kind of like what Moses recognized, like it was more important to like follow God versus like necessarily like obsessing over the promised land.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm not quite finding the right words right now, but like the theme to me is similar. Like,
well, yeah, because he doesn't say I will cut myself off from Israel. He says I will cut off Israel from the land. Mm-hmm. Right? So he's not saying I'm going to abandon Israel. He says I'm going to take Israel and remove them from the land. Mm-hmm. Because the land is not the essential component. Right? Like if that...
Yeah, that's pretty much what I'm getting at. Especially like during this time, just because they're at their height of prosperity too. Yeah. So it's like... I wouldn't really like to make comparisons like modern day just because this is much more like significant. But I mean, really, it's the same as like a wealthy person. It's like you like all that wealth they're kind of holding on to. Yeah. It's like, you know, if you're being unfaithful, God might take that from under you. Yeah.
Which I really like the phrase, which I have given them. Right? Remember who gave you this. Yeah. Right? You might have built the temple. You might have conquered the land. But you were only able to do that because Yahweh empowered you to do it. Right? I gave it to you. I can take it away. Right? And this is true. Like, this is the theology we have to have for God. Right? He can give and he can take. He gave us life. He can take that life. He gave us breath. He can take that breath. He gave us blood. He can take that blood.
It's like Job.
Yeah. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Right? Like, that's what he's saying. I will cut off from Israel from the land which I have given them. Right? I gave it to you. I can take it back. Right? God is totally fine with Indian giving. Right? You know, like you know what Indian giving is, right? It's like whenever you give somebody a gift and then you take it back. People say don't be an Indian giver. God can do that. Right? But that, I mean, I wouldn't encourage you to be that way. If you give a gift, let the person have it. But God can. Yeah. But notice, he says, I'll cut Israel off from the land which I have given them, and the house which I have set apart as holy for my name, I will cast out of my presence. So, like, they're going to leave the land, but he's also casting them out of his presence. He doesn't say that he's cutting them off from him entirely, but he's saying that they're not going to be near him, right? They're going to be out of the land, but he's already said, I'm dwelling in Jerusalem forever, right? The house might be gone, and he might depart there for a little bit. He might go on a little vacation or sabbatical, as we're going to see happen later on in the story. but he's not going with them, right? Whenever they're off in exile, they're going to be saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? This is significant, right? I'm mainly emphasizing this because, like, when you read later books of the Bible or later Psalms and stuff, this gives context to the things that it's saying. Like, whenever, like, there's one Psalm, I forget, it's like Psalm 130 something, where they're saying, like, how can we sing, like, it literally says they're singing, like, they're writing from the rivers of Babylon. And it says, how can we sing, like, songs to God from here? Right? Like, because they're like, we're not near him. Like, he's over there, we're over here. How can we sing songs to him? That's what he's getting at here, right? I'll send you away, I'll cut you off from the land, and I won't go with you. Oof.
Ouch.
Yeah, temporary separation.
Yeah. Again, I guess it's kind of like what he proposed to do to Moses in the Exodus story. It's like, y'all can go to the promised land, but I'm not going to be there with you.
Yeah.
This time it's not the promised land, it's Babylon. But
Yeah, he's like, you can get out of the promised land, and I'm staying. It's like, yeah, that's fair. But that's the thing. Like, it kind of calls back to that story, but now they don't have a choice, right? With Moses, it was a test. He says, y'all can go to the promised land, I'm not going to go with you. And Moses said, if you're not going, we're not going. In this instance, they have no choice, right? There is no Moses to say, we're not going. No, you are going because this is discipline, right? Like, you will leave and you will depart, right? Like, that's the heartbreaking element,
yeah.
right? There's no intercessor to be like, no, please let us. No,
It's too late.
get out. It's too late. Like, that's really the whole point.
It's
Yeah.
saddening.
Anything else before you keep reading?
And this house will become. Were you talking about reading on
Just
other
like
verses?
through like the
Okay,
first half
okay,
of 7, yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So Israel will become a proverb and a byword among all peoples. And this house will become a heap of ruins. Everyone who passes by will feel desolate and hiss and say, why has Yahweh done thus to this land and to this house? So what's happening there?
I think it's just so interesting that in the previous verses he literally said, I'm going to dwell in this house forever.
Mm.
But he says, if you don't do this, the house will become a heap of ruins.
Yeah.
Which forces you to go back and figure out what did he mean by the previous verse.
Yeah.
Right,
I was thinking the same thing.
It implies that he's talking about something a little bit different.
Mm.
Right? So the house might be destroyed, but at the same time the house is not destroyed. Right? It's like, okay, so it's not the building that's significant. Right? It's the presence of God in this place that is significant. The house has no significance. Like, the building is just stone upon stone.
Yeah.
But his house will be in Jerusalem forever. Right?
Yeah. And I think we're all guilty, both them and us, we're guilty sometimes of, what's the word? Confining God's presence to, like, a physical object.
Yeah.
Like, we do that with the church building sometimes. There could have been a temptation with the temple to do that. And then, what is it? I think later on in 1st or 2nd Kings, there's, like, the Nehushtan, the bronze serpent,
Yeah.
where it's like people are literally sacrificing to it.
Yeah.
So it's like the very thing that God, had Moses make that was like a symbol of what Christ was going to do for salvation, they actually like sacrificed to it.
Yeah.
And so, yeah. So I also think it's interesting that it says that Israel will become like a proverb and a byword. I guess the main imagery there is like the idea of like they become like a lesson almost.
Yeah, people will look at them and they'll be like, well, don't be like Israel. Those
Yes.
people did not learn, those people were not faithful to God, right? Which makes sense. Right? I just think this is cool too. It emphasizes the role of Israel again, right?
Yeah, this whole thing.
Because
yeah.
Israel's failure still produces the gospel to the Gentiles, right? So Israel can be faithful and they can be sent into exile. And what is the result? They're a proverb and a byword among all peoples. Who is all peoples? Gentiles, right? So if Israel fails, the Gentiles will learn a lesson from their failure.
Yeah.
If Israel is faithful, the Gentiles will learn a lesson from their faithfulness, right? So either way, that's what God is accomplishing through Israel, right? To where Israel are his people, but God never loses the end goal, right? Like his goal is to bring all peoples back to him. And so when people see, literally, what are we talking about right now? We are Gentiles sitting here and we are treating Israel like proverbs and bywords because we know where this story's heading. We know they are going to go into exile, and we're going to learn from this, and we're going to be like, let's not be like Solomon.
That's why I say it's like almost prophetic.
Well, it is, right? I mean, this is like everything he's saying is prophetic because it's going to come true. And I think that the author knew this, right? I mean, he's writing to a people who are in exile. And he's like, guys, y'all are the byword. Like, y'all are the proverb that people are learning from here. This house will become a heap of ruins. I mean, think about this, like, the original audience. These are the people who knew it was a heap of ruins. Right? I mean, presuming that 1st and 2nd Kings were written at the same time, these are people in exile who know that the house is a heap of ruins. I mean, it had to be heartbreaking, right? It's like, if you read all of 1 Kings from the perspective of the original audience, this had to be so sad. Like, we read 1 Kings chapter 8, and we're like, wow, this is amazing. Imagine you were reading 1 Kings chapter 8 as a Jewish person in exile. You're like, how far have we come? Right? You're looking at Solomon, and you're like, wow, this is amazing. And then you go to the next chapter, and God says, if you're not careful, heap of ruins. And then the people in exile are saying, we weren't careful. Right? So if you're reading it, you're like, oh, like it all begins to kind of make sense.
Yeah. Wow. I don't think it's that important, but isn't the word for heap, isn't it like a tall structure? Like a
it might be
rising up or something?
I'm not sure. I can look it up.
Like a huge pile of something?
I think it's in my footnotes.
Heap? Look up too. Probably the same definition as David's.
I don't know if it's important.
Elion. It means higher, upper, yeah.
Okay.
It would become an Elion of ruins. It's actually where we get the name Elion for like God. Like the Most High.
Elion or something? Yeah,
Yeah.
God Most High, yeah. It's true.
Everyone who passes by will feel desolate and hiss. Like they'll literally feel the sadness.
Yeah.
And they'll say, why has Yahweh done this? Like they'll literally feel bad for the people of Israel because of what's going on here.
Like, I'm not as familiar with the prophets, but that verse, like, it made me think of, like, a lot of the later prophets. Like, isn't that kind of, like, one of the things that's brought up a lot? Is, like, people will walk past, like, Jerusalem being, like, desolate.
Well, yeah, there's a huge emphasis on the shame that's going to be accompanied by it, right? It's not just, like, a private event where they get to be destroyed and, you know, nobody gets to see their failure. It's like, no. Jerusalem will lie in ashes. Everybody will see it. They'll all hiss at you. They'll all despise it. They'll feel kind of bad for you, but it's more like, it's not a compassion bad, it's like a pity bad. Like, wow, those poor, pitiful people. They didn't learn their lesson. Yeah, that's like a huge emphasis throughout the prophets for sure. Yeah. And they will say, because they forsook Yahweh, I love this like hypothetical scenario, right? People are going to ask, wow, why is this desolate? And somebody will say, it's because they forsook Yahweh their God, who brought their father, like, notice the emphasis. He brought their fathers out of the land of Egypt and took hold of other gods and worshipped them and served them. Therefore, he always brought calamity on them. Right? They had the audacity to abandon the one who did everything for them. They were slaves. They were nothing. He brought them out and he made them everything. He gave them a temple. He gave them all this stuff. He gave them a land flowing with milk and honey. What did they do? Chase after other gods.
He came to dwell with them.
Yeah. This is like, I don't know, a super rich king coming and marrying a super poor girl and making her everything, right? Makes her a queen, gives her everything. And then she goes and cheats on him with like, I don't know, some slave. Right? It's like, what? like, he did everything for you. He gave you so much. You were nothing before you met him. And then you do this? Like that's kind of the idea.
Yeah. It seems like pretty much like a lot of times when they always bring up like the Exodus story. It's very significant.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that in the hypothetical situation, Gentiles hundreds of years later know about the event says something.
Oh yeah.
Because I mean, they wouldn't have had part of the reason why people know about it so much now is because we have media and stuff. But
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I think it's significant.
Yeah. The Exodus is 100% the event that the Bible spends the most time looking back at. Like throughout the whole Old Testament, it's always calling back to the Exodus. Almost every book of the prophets is talking about the Exodus in the past and how there's going to be like a new Exodus in the future. Like it's all Exodus imagery.
Yeah, it's like the I forget the word that you said, but yeah, it's just like it's just really is like one of the biggest events that really showcase like what God's power and stuff.
Yeah.
Because I mean, really, that whole story was about him like defeating other gods. So I mean, even within that story, it's like, you know, the fact that they'd be taking hold of other gods and worshiping them. It's like the whole point of that story was that he is better than those gods.
Yeah.
So it's like he proves that he's better than all these other ones, but then they still go for that one. It's like,
Yeah, it makes no sense.
it makes no sense at all.
Right? It's like these people having like this full out Rayleigh, like just going all out, beating each other up to figure out who the toughest guy is, so that a girl can figure out who she wants to have as her bodyguard. And this one dude wins with his hands tied behind his back, right? Like he easily is like the toughest dude in the whole room, and then she just picks like some scrawny dude over there, and they're like, "Did you miss the point of that whole story? Like we just had this whole competition to prove that this is the guy who's best equipped to be the bodyguard, and then were you sleeping? Like what? How did you miss the point? The Gentiles didn't miss the point. The Gentiles were afraid of Yahweh. I mean, like, that's literally the story. Whenever you get to, like, the book of Joshua, like, whenever the people are entering into Jericho, the people of Canaan are terrified. Like, it's really ironic because, like, the Israelites were afraid to go into Canaan because they were afraid of the Canaanites. Meanwhile, the Canaanites are freaking out because Yahweh is with Israel. And they're like, oh my gosh, like, we've heard that Yahweh is a really big deal. Like, and like Rahab's like, hey, could you like spare us? Like everybody's terrified of your God. Like, so like the Canaanites have learned the lesson. Everybody has recognized that Yahweh is super awesome. But then Israel's like, you know what? We want to be like everybody else. It's like, what? Like, I don't know. It's like, I don't know. Grass is greener on the other side, I guess. Like, you know, everybody gets to... I mean, I think you see this in, like, human relationships, where it's like, you can see, like, this couple, and you've got this, like, amazing guy, or, like, you know, like, one of the people is way out of the other person's league, right? And everybody else can see it, and they're like, wow, this person does not deserve this person. Like, that person is amazing. Meanwhile, the person who doesn't deserve them is, like, just taking them for granted, and, like, does not realize what they have. And you're like, wow, like you should be more appreciative of this person because you don't deserve them. Like, I think you see that. That's kind of what Israel is. Like, everybody else can see what they have, but they don't.
It makes me think of our country, though, because when we started out as a country, we were a Christian nation, and now
Built on Christian values, at least.
And now we're like our country as a whole is straight from God. So, I mean, we're no different than Israel.
Huh. I think we're just like the other nations. Like, we've all strayed from God. Everybody's strayed from God.
Yeah.
I think, like, I this is a controversial opinion. I think that overall that's a net positive for America. Namely because it gets us further away from cultural Christianity. Because back whenever Christian was more built on just Christian values, there were a lot of people who probably identified as Christian just because they grew up going to church. I'm not saying it's a net positive that less people are Christian and like identifying as that, but I'm saying I think it's like if we can distinguish America and Christianity a little bit more, I think that's good.
Yeah.
Because it allows us to figure out who is genuinely a Christian rather than you just simply being Christian because you're patriotic. Because those are not the same thing, right? For Israel, that worked. Because if you were a follower of God, you would, you'd live with Israel. But
it was God's chosen nation.
Yeah.
Right.
For us, but I do agree that we have moved away from Christian values, for sure. All right, we should probably move on because it's like 8:30.
Oh boy. I'm not even halfway through.
It's all right.
Yeah.
That section was the more like theologically dense section.
So that's true. Most of the next part's pretty much narrative. There's a couple like weird things, but they're pretty easy to go through.
Yeah. And maybe before we read that, just to finish up that whole thing right there, that's the warning, right? Because now we're heading into the actual like narrative section. Like, really the big question going forward is whether or not Solomon is going to heed the warning, right? Because we really don't get to see Solomon's response. We really just get to see what Solomon does afterwards.
That's
right?
true.
Whereas, like, in the first encounter, we had this back and forth between Yahweh and God, right? Where God's, like, really, it's almost kind of flip-flopped, where in the first account, God spoke kind of very little. And Solomon was the one who was like, hey, here's what I need. I need a hearing heart, because I don't know how to govern these people. Whereas here, we don't even get to see Solomon say anything. right? I mean, literally, it just says God showed up to him and God started talking, and then God just gives him a warning, right? And so we really don't get to see how Solomon responds, but I think what we're supposed to do is in the verses that follow, we're supposed to see how Solomon responds, right? If that kind of makes sense, right? So if the big question is, what do you want? Well, Solomon doesn't answer it to God. He just receives the warning, and then the verses that follow will help tell us what it is that Solomon wants, if that makes sense. All right.
Yeah.
We can go into the next part. I just kind of wanted to conclude the thought there.
No, that was good. Now it happened that at the end of 20 years in which Solomon had built the two houses, the house of Yahweh and the king's house, Hiram king of Tyre had supplied Solomon with cedar and cypress timber and gold according to all his desire. The king Solomon then gave Hiram 20 cities in the land of Galilee. So Hiram came out from Tyre to see the cities which Solomon had given him, and they were not right in his eyes. And he said, "What are these cities that you have given me, my brother?" So they were called the land of Kabul to this day. And Hiram sent to the king 120 talents of gold. So this is a bit of an interesting passage.
Yeah, it's a weird one.
And we'll talk about a couple things, but because there's a couple of differences between this and the Chronicles account, but I think they're pretty easy to figure out. Any thoughts though?
We did our math right. 13 plus 7 is indeed 20.
Yes.
It
Okay.
mentions Hiram king of Tyre, the person that, the king that made an alliance with Solomon.
Yeah, although I guess really you could even say before that. When did we first hear about Hiram?
David.
Yeah, and that was when? Was that when he first became king? Or was it?
I don't think it really... I'm trying to remember if it... I think it was only really in passing that it even mentioned his relationship with David. I think we've actually learned more about his relationship with David from this account.
Oh, okay.
I'm trying to remember right off the top of my head. I forget.
Yeah, I think it was when David's kingdom was established. It mentioned Hiram, but I don't know if it was I think it was more of a narrative mention versus a dialogue.
Yeah. Let me check real quick. Yeah, 2 Samuel 5:11. Then Hiram king of Tyre sent messengers to David with cedar trees and craftsmen of wood and craftsmen of stone walls, and they built a house for David.
That's
So
right.
it literally just tells us what Hiram did and then just moves on. And then the second time we mention him is in 1 Kings chapter 5.
Yeah. When.
So, and that's where it tells us more about the nature of the relationship. But
Yeah. So we'll go through. So now it happened that at the end of 20 years in which Solomon had built the two houses, the house of Yahweh and the king's house. So that's 7 years for the house of Yahweh and then 13 for Solomon's palace/palace complex. Hiram king of Tyre had supplied Solomon with cedar and cypress timber and gold according to all his desire. And we read that in chapter 5, 6. And I think Hiram literally told him whatever however much you desire, I'll give to you. With that was the whole story with the rafts and stuff. The king Solomon then gave Hiram 20 cities in the land of Galilee. So where would this be? That'd be
North.
North, yeah.
yeah.
North of, northern Israel.
Yeah, which would be closer to where Hiram's at, which makes sense.
Yeah.
Northern Israel.
I guess most accounts say it's the ones that border. I was reading something. It was saying that these cities may not have been conquered up until recently, so they had primarily Canaanites in them. I don't know if that's true or if that's just.
It might be speculation because I don't know. Unless Chronicles tells us more information, I think this is probably all we have to go with.
Yeah.
So I
No,
don't
because actually the thing with the Chronicles account is different. Is we don't even read about him giving Hiram cities. We actually read that Hiram gave him cities.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I was gonna pull it up because I was looking at it just to see what exactly was going on there, and because if you don't think about it, it sounds almost contradictory, but you can figure it out pretty easily. It's 2 Chronicles 8, the first couple of verses.
Now it came about that at the end of the 20 years in which Solomon had built the house of the Lord and his house, that he built the cities which Hiram had given to him, Hiram being Hiram's in person, and settle the sons of Israel there. And then Solomon went to Hamath Zobah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the next slide it'll mention that same event. Because
Yeah.
the Chronicle account is like almost word for word the same.
Yeah.
I think some of the names are like a vowel off. That's pretty much it.
Yeah. Yeah. So it could just be referring to different cities.
It could
Or
be,
it could be that Hiram returned the cities.
Yeah, I want to say, I think most people agree it's either different cities because the whole thing is that Kabul, sounds like a Phoenician word meaning like good for nothing.
Yeah, it's worthless.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so I don't know that, and with verse 14, people like speculate different things. I don't think it's that hard to figure out. There's like a few reasonable suggestions, but it is possible that Hiram just simply gave them back to Solomon, and that's where that picks up. It just doesn't like because Chronicles and Kings, they obviously don't all mention the same exact events. Some stuff is mentioned here but not there, and vice versa.
Yeah. This is a really interesting account to me because there's so much ambiguity here, which I think makes sense after the warning God just gave him. Because it's really hard to figure out what the heck Solomon's doing, right? Like, first off, it seems like he's trying to impress Hiram by giving him cities, but then you have to ask, I don't really have an answer of whether or not this is good or bad, but like, should Solomon be giving up 20 cities of Israel to Hiram? Right? I know that Hiram did stuff to him, like gave stuff to him, but this is the covenantal land of Israel, right? And so I looked into this because this is a weird passage to me, and people debate about that.
Yeah.
Right? Was it good for him to give these cities or not? Like, is he beginning to lean too much into this alliance or not? Right? I mean, I don't know. Like, I think that the debate makes sense because it's a weird thing, right?
Yeah, the whole thing is weird.
Like, it's one thing to be exchanging money, but now you are giving some of the land which God promised to Israel to a foreign king. Well, that seems to be an issue, which then leads to some ambiguity in regards to Hiram's response. Because when he says, "What are these cities which you have given to me, my brother?" and calls them Kabul, well, you want to know the inflection in his voice. Is he insulted by this? Or is he saying that it's unnecessary? Right? He's like, no, I don't need these, right? Because he follows it up by giving money to Solomon. Right? So, like, is this hurting Solomon's relationship with him? Or is he just saying, Solomon, I don't need anything from you? Right? Like what does he mean? Right? Like there's a lot of ambiguity here, which I think begins to pave the way for the more tragic turns in Solomon's life later on. Right? It's almost like before, it was very clear that what Hiram and Solomon had was good. Whereas here, you could have an argument that this is bad just as much as that it's good. Right?
That's how the Judges started out.
Well, exactly.
It
Right?
wasn't as much outright sinful as it was more morally ambiguous.
Yeah, like I think it's just I think that's kind of where we're at here, right? Because I've seen like commentators debate each way. Some people say that Solomon should not have done this, and that was bad. But then some people, they're emphasizing the fact that this is hurting his relationship with Hiram because he gave Hiram cities, but he didn't give him good cities, and so Hiram did all this stuff for him, and Solomon kind of gave him the lesser stuff, and now Solomon is hurting the image of God amongst the Gentiles. And I could see the arguments in all directions, but it almost begins, you see that Solomon might not be governing himself as wisely as he was before.
Yeah.
Right? Whenever he calls, I guess it kind of hinders, it hinges around how the word Kabul is being used. Right? Whenever he says it's worthless, is he saying it's worthless in the sense of these cities are terrible, you ripped me off? Mm-hmm. Or is he saying these are worthless to me because I don't need anything from you?
Yeah.
I don't know, right? I mean, it's
yeah, because I've seen different things as to how 13 and 14 connect. Some people suggest that the 14 is more so connected to 11, and then others will connect 13 and 14. So some people think that maybe it was Hiram was maybe not as offended as it seems to be. It's he was not flattered but not offended, he still that was payment for the cities.
Yeah.
But some people will also say that maybe it's calling back to verse 11 to say this is what he
felt cheated.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's hey dude, these are worthless to me. I gave you 120 talents of gold. Right?
Yeah,
so it's suggesting that
it's Hiram had sent.
Yes. Yeah. It's almost instead of and, it could say for. right?
Yeah.
So they
Yeah.
were called land of Kabul to this day, for Hiram had sent 120 talents of gold, right? I sent you gold and you gave me these worthless cities, right?
Yeah.
I could see that making sense, right? I mean, like, I don't know. Like, to me, it's a very ambiguous passage. I would lean more towards the negative end of things.
That's where I was leaning to. It just
Yeah.
Yeah. Because, I mean, also if you want to go with like, I don't even know if like the stuff we're gonna talk about later is really, again, it's morally ambiguous with the his treatment of foreigners. But if you're reading that as like much more negative, then it also could make sense that would also come back to here because as it being more negative because before it seemed like before this chapter when things were a lot better or less ambiguous, he had a really good relationship with Gentiles and things were all good, but as things are starting to come back down, it makes sense that maybe the first thing to go would be his treatment of foreigners.
Yeah, makes sense.
Like, if the kingdom's gonna start declining, it's not gonna start with, Solomon building the temple and then treating Israelites bad. It's gonna start with treating like the Gentiles less.
Yeah. I just love that this is my brother at the end.
Yeah.
It's like, bro, what the heck is this? I thought we were cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
The phrase "not right in his eyes," I think that's interesting. Just because anytime you see the phrase "right in his eyes," it reminds me of Judges.
Yeah.
Right, which I think that's what we're seeing. I think that this is an intentional thing where we're beginning to enter into a section that is familiar territory if you've read the book of Judges. Right? And so we have somebody looking at something that's not right in his eyes. Well, we're beginning to head into an area where people are going to start doing what's right in their own eyes.
Yep.
Right. I would say it's literally 2 chapters foreshadowing Civil War and like just what a Judges end with Civil War.
Yeah.
Dang, I thought there was something else I was gonna say. Oh, I just read it's not that important, but apparently there's a Josephus account of like a story. I don't know if you read about that.
I'm not sure.
Apparently some people attribute that whole verse 14 to something completely different. And it's a Josephus account, so you can't really like read that into here. But apparently Solomon and Hiram had some kind of like a competition where they were like having to solve riddles.
Nice.
And apparently Hiram lost, and that was his payment for losing.
Nice.
And then apparently he later retaliated. I guess that's also one way people reconcile. They'll say like apparently like Hiram retaliated, and I guess like later on gave the cities back or something like that. I don't know, but I just thought it was funny because I know before you were reading Josephus. But.
Yeah. If anything, I guess you could summarize this by just saying that Solomon is getting more than he's giving right now, which overall is probably a net negative.
Yeah.
Right? To be fair, he does try to give something, but the person calls it worthless, which is usually just not a good sign either way. Whether he's saying it in a bad way or just a neutral way, I mean, like, the cities were apparently given back. So, yeah.
Yeah. So, I don't know. Like we said, just going from like the way things were, where it was like pretty straightforward, like this was good or bad, and now it's like getting very ambiguous very quickly.
Yeah.
Definitely
Not a great sign.
Yeah.
Now this is the account of the forced labor which King Solomon raised up to build the house of Yahweh, his own house, the Milo, the wall of Jerusalem, Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. For Pharaoh, king of Egypt, had gone up and captured Gezer and burned it with fire, and killed the Canaanites who lived in the city, and had given it as a dowry to his daughter, Solomon's wife. So Solomon rebuilt Gezer in the lower Beth Horon, and Baalath and Tamar in the wilderness, and the land of Judah, and all the storage cities which Solomon had, and the cities for his chariots, and the cities for his horsemen, and all that Solomon desired to build in Jerusalem, in Lebanon, and all the land under his rule. As for all the people who were left of the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, who were not of the sons of Israel, namely, their sons who were left after them in the land, whom the sons of Israel were unable to devote to destruction, from them Solomon raised up forced laborers to this day. But Solomon did not make slaves of the sons of Israel, for they were men of war, his servants. his princes, his captains, his chariot commanders, and his horsemen. It's also significant to know. I mean, we'll talk about it, but the fact that now it brings up the horses and stuff again.
Mm-hmm.
Horses and chariots.
Once again, you're it's so sad. You're beginning to see the cracks. You're like, oh no, this is not good. But once again, ambiguous passage, right? There's some good stuff here, and there's some bad stuff here.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that now Solomon, he's done what God's called him to do, and we get to see here what we see in Ecclesiastes, right? He's going about many projects, right? It like now that he's completed what God's called him to do, he's a man who doesn't know what to do, and so he just keeps doing what he's done best, and he just expands the empire, right? And he starts going about many projects. It's interesting when you read Ecclesiastes, you know the backstory to this, right? Like we see him doing this, and we don't know when he wrote Ecclesiastes, but I'm hoping this is at the end of his life and that he repented. But like he says, like I devoted myself to many projects of great size, and through all that, my wisdom was still with me. Right? I made building projects. I had slaves. I had all this stuff, and like that's like the background of all this information. It's interesting.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that, but yeah.
Yeah.
Anything else?
I say we walk through it.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's walk through.
Now this is the account of the forced labor which King Solomon raised up to build the house of Yahweh, his own house, the Milo, the wall of Jerusalem, Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer.
Fun fact: you can still go visit the Milo today.
Really?
Yeah, when you go to the city of David, it's there. You can see it.
That's
Yeah.
like the Citadel, is what it's
Uh-huh.
called. Well, that's what it means, but
Yeah, it's like a fortified wall.
oh, it's just a wall.
Yeah. It's like I mean, I don't know. The Milo might refer to more than that, but the thing that we have preserved is the fortified wall. Like it was originally a Jebusite. Like whenever the Jebusites occupied the area, they built it, but then like David and Solomon fortified it more to where.
I remember the Milo was mentioned in the Samuel chapter when David captured Jerusalem.
Yeah. So if you actually go, because the city of David now is like an archaeological dig, and the Milo is something you can go see. Which is cool. I think it's neat. Also, this is just stuff that I find fascinating. This is like some biblical support stuff, like apologetics type things. Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. Right? This verse right here, really significant. Because it mentions that Solomon had building projects in those three cities. And sure enough, we have excavated stuff, like in those three cities, we've excavated stuff that dates back to the time of Solomon. And whenever you look at just the entrance gates to those three cities, they all reflect being designed by a similar architect, right? So like that's like a small thing that adds credibility to this account, right? Mm-hmm. It's not just saying that Solomon went and did this. No, at that time period, there was somebody very wise. Like think about it. Nowadays, like we can just like copy and paste stuff, and like we can like Google Earth things to make sure that the dimensions are the same. No, like somehow there was a very wise person who designed these things so that whenever you actually compare them at these different locations, they have the same type of structure and same design plan. They're not exactly the same, but they have like the same dimensions and like proportionality and like facing the same direction. It's actually really cool. Mm-hmm. And there's actually, I think, 2 other cities that aren't mentioned here, but they date the same period and have that same plan. I just think that's really cool.
That's cool.
Like in our apologetics group, when we go through the biblical archaeology, I'll show you all the gates. I just think it's really neat that it mentions Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. Actually, whenever we went to Megiddo, Ben, I don't think that Pilar showed us through those gates, but I went and took pictures of them while we were there because I was excited.
I think I know where those gates are.
Yeah, it was really neat. But we didn't walk over there as a group, but I wandered from the group and took pictures.
Megiddo, that's by Jerusalem, right?
No, Megiddo's up. It's like halfway between, like it's in like the Jezreel Valley area.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And then Hazor and Gezer.
I forget where those ones are. I've never been there.
I'm assuming Gezer is more south, just because of Pharaoh capturing it. But I mean, I guess that doesn't.
Yeah.
I guess it doesn't really mean it has to be that far south.
Yeah,
Because they had an alliance. But
yeah.
I don't remember.
Yeah, foothills of the Judean mountains.
Okay. Well, I guess it does say that they're all in the land of Judah. Or wait, no, that's a little wrong.
Yeah, it's west of Jerusalem.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, let's walk through it.
For Pharaoh, king of Egypt, had gone up and captured Gezer and burned it with fire, and killed the Canaanites who lived in the city, and had given it as a dowry to his daughter, Solomon's wife.
So I'm assuming this is back whenever they got married.
I would assume so.
Yeah, because like it even says, verse 15, that this is like an account of the forced labor for all this, right? So it's kind of it's not chronologically like after all the events we just read. Happy marriage, daughter. Here's this city with all these dead people in it. I burned it with fire and killed the Canaanites. Here's to a happy marriage.
There's
I guess. Sorry.
There's way more crying at this wedding than most.
Yeah.
I guess it also tells you that like not every single city in Israel, like there's still Canaanites that were like around.
Yeah, it's really interesting whenever you just like look at it, because like even during David's reign, like he has to conquer Jerusalem. So it's weird. Like it's like they had made a nation there, but it seems like there are some cities where it's like the people just minded their own business and they just let them dwell there, right?
Yeah.
Which is just it's kind of weird. Like that's something that we see. There's never been a point where literally all of Israel has truly been like conquered, right? There's always like these like pocket cities. There's like, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it makes sense just because I mean the world wasn't as connected as it is now. Like even not that related, but learning about like the Bronze Age collapse, it was like there'd be places where it'd be like severely affected, but then there'd be random pockets of like pretty like they wouldn't be that affected just because they weren't really like dependent on anybody.
Yeah.
But so Solomon rebuilt Gezer in the lower Beth Horon, and Baalath and Tamar in the wilderness, in the land of Judah, and all the storage cities which Solomon had, and the cities for his chariots, and the cities for his horsemen, and all that Solomon desired to build in Jerusalem, and Lebanon, and all the land under his rule.
A lot of building projects.
I mean, he even says all that Solomon desired, which I think in Ecclesiastes he says his heart out to like do that.
Yeah. Yeah. All that Solomon desired to build in Jerusalem. Lebanon, all the land under his rule. Yeah.
I guess really that phrase kind of has been repeated several times throughout the Kings. I mean, even earlier in the chapter, it said all he desired to build. I don't know if that's significant, but...
Well, I think that it's an emphasis because, once again, I think that the underlying question, that it hasn't even been directly said, I think the underlying question is, what do you desire? Yeah. Right? Because that's the question he asked in chapter 3. Right? Solomon, what do you desire? I'll give it to you. Well, now he's appeared to Solomon again, and the underlying question is, what do you desire? Right? You've finished what you desired to do. You built a temple and you built a palace. That's good. What do you desire now? Right? I think that's really the lingering question, and that's going to be the thing that makes or breaks Solomon. Right? Because it's not enough to have wisdom, it's about getting your desires in check. So I think that it is significant for sure.
And I guess also, like, even when it says, like, all that he desired to build, it's also asking the question of, like, why he's building it to.
Yeah, are you building it...
Like, for what reason are you building it? Not just what you desire to build necessarily, but, like, why? Like, why are you building the house? Why are you building, like, the temple? But also, why are you doing these things?
Some good application points there, right? Like, you understood why he was building the temple, right? It was for the people of God to be able to worship God. You understood why he built the palace. Why is he building all these places for chariots and horses? Probably because he wants to multiply chariots and horses, right? Why is he building all these things up? Is it because it'll serve the people? Or is it because it'll serve himself in his own glory? Same thing. Why is it that we're so focused on growing our churches? Is it because we want to give glory to God? Or is it because we want to give glory to self? Why is it that we want to add this addition to the church? Is it because we want to be impressive? Or is it because we want to serve God, right? Like, that really, I think it really is about desire. Yeah. Like, this is what you desire to do. Why do you desire it? Right? That's really getting to the essence of it. Whenever Solomon, like the first time God showed up to him, he asked him, what do you desire? And Solomon's desires were selfless. I desire a hearing heart that I may serve the people. That's a good answer. Now the question is, now that you've been giving a hearing heart to serve the people and that you've served the people how you were called to do it, what are you going to do with the rest of your life? What do you desire now? Do you still desire what you desired before? Do you desire to serve the people or do you desire to serve yourself? Right? That's really probably a good question for all of us, right? Not only what do you desire, why do you desire it? Right? For Solomon, that's going to be the thing that breaks him. And Ecclesiastes gives us the answer, right? He didn't desire to build these things for the glory of God. He desired to build them because he was trying to figure out what he was meant for. He's like, I couldn't find meaning, right? Everything was vanity. So I went about building projects. Like he's a guy, like we all do this, right? It's like, it's almost like just, it's like why people always put headphones in their ears. They can't deal with the silence, right? They need something to constantly distract them to avoid the vacancy in their own hearts. That's why Solomon's doing this. And the author of Kings isn't answering this for us, right? Because the author of Kings is just telling us what's happening so that the ball will drop in chapter 11 and it'll all click in our heads why he was doing it. But in Ecclesiastes, he gives us the behind-the-scenes look. Here's why, right? If you want to know why I did all that stuff, here's the answer. And it's because he didn't answer the warning of God. But to go with what you were just talking about the how not everybody. Oh, that was cool. The Superman logo showed up on my watch. Sweet. Sorry. You were talking about how not everybody had been run off. You have that emphasized again in verse 20. As for all the people who were left of the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, who were not of the sons of Israel, namely, their sons who were left after them in the land, whom the sons of Israel were unable to devote to destruction, from them Solomon raised up forced laborers to this day. So we get the idea that not everybody had been run off. So you still have that lingering group of people.
Yeah, that's true.
Those two words, forced laborers, makes me think of him starting to go down the downward spiral of doing what he wants to do, and then eventually we'll get to chapter 11 and he multiplies wives.
Why is that?
Well, he forced people to do things for him.
Well, I guess that does beg the question, is that, the thing we read about previously, we couldn't really determine whether it was like objectively good or bad. It was pretty ambiguous. So I guess that begs the question: did Solomon do what he did here? Was that right? Was that the right thing to do? Was that good? Was that bad? What do y'all think?
This is another thing I would say is in the ambiguous category.
Yeah.
I don't think it's just because of the slavery aspect. I think nowadays with our current lens, we naturally look back on whenever we read slavery, we think, ooh, that's immediately bad. I think that's kind of like a chronological snobbery position. I do agree that God's design for humanity was that slavery not exist. But I don't think that every time slavery is mentioned in the Bible, it's mentioned in a negative light. Right? I think that we just have to acknowledge that that was the culture at the time. That's okay. Right?
Yeah.
I think the main issue is how he's handling the Canaanites. Because the Israelites were unable to devote them to destruction, which they were supposed to kill them. Right? Basically, it's like either kill them or kick them out of the land. Solomon is making them slaves. To me, that seems kind of like a compromise. And it sounds very similar to what we read at the beginning of the book of Judges.
I was just going to say that, then it makes you ask, why were they unable to devote to destruction?
Because whenever you read the book of Judges, that's what you read. Remember, there were some cities that they didn't conquer, and they devoted, they made them slaves. But that's missing the point of what God was going for, right? There's a reason they had to either be killed or kicked out. And really, killed was the ideal, because if you kicked them out, they might come back with a vengeance and fight. Yeah. Right? And so really, you were supposed to devote them to destruction because these people were going to lead you astray. And so at the beginning of Judges, you see them enslaving them, and it seems like the people of Israel mistakenly assumed that the whole goal was just to flex their power on them. That's not what God was concerned with. He was concerned with the influence these people would have. Right? And if they're alive, they might be slaves, but their influence is still there.
Well, I mean, what was the next part of the Judges? Was that they married the women.
Exactly. Right? Like it shortly follows. If you allow the people, you're enslaving the men, but the women aren't going to be slaves. Right? I mean, they might do work, but they're not going to be able to, they're not going to be good for much when it comes to manual labor. Right? And so what do you do with the women? You probably marry them. Right? You take them as wives. And so I think that, this is once again more ambiguous to negative. Right? Because the good thing is that he isn't just leaving the foreigners there, but he's doing the same thing that they did in Judges, and we saw where that story ended up, right? I would say verse 22 is on the more positive end of things, right? Because that actually kind of lines up with the Torah a little bit. Because if you actually look at the law does talk about having foreign slaves, right? I don't think that the law was talking about foreign slaves who were living in the land of Canaan prior, though, right? Because those people are supposed to devote to destruction, right? I think this is the idea of like if you buy slaves from elsewhere and bring them in, right? But once again, that's why I'm saying that you can't immediately say verse 21 is negative, because there is a way where you could read the law and arrive at the conclusion that what Solomon's doing is correct. I'm just not convinced that that is what the law was suggesting, if that makes sense. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Well, again, the familiarity with the previous books of the Bible, if you're reading it as a continuous narrative,
Yeah.
from a literary perspective, you can see why there'd be issues there
Yeah.
with Judges, and also, like I said, the fact that it specifically mentions like the ones that are unable to devote to destruction. It could have just said they just chose to like save some as slaves, but the fact that it specifically says that they were unable to devote to destruction, to me seems like an intentional phrase there.
Yeah, I was wanting to figure out. I was trying to figure out what the Torah was. I think it's Leviticus 25, maybe. Let me check. The specific law I'm talking about in regards to slaves. It might not be Leviticus 25, but I will look anyways. I know it's already 9 o'clock, but that's all right. Leviticus 25. Oh, geez. If a countryman of yours becomes so poor with regard to you that he sells himself to you, you shall not subject him to a slave service. He shall be with you as a hired man, as if he were a sojourner. He shall serve you until the year of Jubilee. He shall then go out from you, he and his sons with him, and he shall go back to his family, and he may return the property of the forefathers. Right? So the idea is that Israelites are not allowed to enslave other Israelites. Right? So if they are to have slaves, they are supposed to be foreigners. Right? And so that's why I'm saying, like, there is an ambiguity here to where I could understand how from one reading of the law, you could justify what Solomon's doing. However, given the commands that God gave to the people who were conquering the land, I could see how this would not be what Solomon's called to do. Right? The question is Solomon supposed to treat the foreigners in the same way that Joshua and them were supposed to treat the foreigners? Right? Because it's been hundreds of years since then.
Yeah.
Right? So it's almost like Solomon's having to handle the question how we handle stuff, right? Like, okay, the command God gave to them, was that a command for Joshua or was that a command for me as well? Right? Like, that's really, I think that's what it comes down to, and I think it's ambiguous enough for us to leave it there. If that makes sense, right? To where it's like, okay, from one reading, yes, that's right. From another reading, not right. The issue is that if Solomon's motives were pure, I think that he would have the wisdom to discern correctly. And I think that if he was discerning correctly, the text would go out of its way to make that explicit. And it might lean towards it in verse 22, but I don't know. I think that we're just... The fact that this whole section started with a warning, and then we followed it up with like 2 back-to-back narratives that are relatively ambiguous, I think that's purposeful on the part of the author, right?
Yeah.
It's like Solomon has the wisdom, but he's no longer really conducting himself according to it. Right? He's doing things, but we don't get to see the reasoning behind why anymore. We don't even see Solomon speaking, right? We just see him doing.
That, I feel like before also, like, I feel like the word wisdom hasn't really been popping up like it used to either.
Yeah.
Like I feel like before when he was doing wise things, I feel like the word wise is popping up a lot. Like
Yeah.
it was either saying he was acting in wisdom, or his wisdom was with him, or just he was very wise. But I haven't seen the word at all pop up.
Yeah. And it will show up back in chapter 10 again.
Oh, okay.
But I still think that's a fair point right now.
Anything else before you can move on?
But Solomon did not make slaves of the sons of Israel, for they were the men of war, his servants, his princes, his captains, his chariot commanders, and his horsemen. So I think that is a positive thing. He didn't enslave Israel. Like, that's according to the law, right? You don't slave fellow Israelites, right? So, like, I think that it's fair that he needed to have forced labor from somewhere, but the issue is we've seen that he already has diplomatic relations where he could get labor from other places, right?
Yeah.
He has relationships with Egypt. He has relationships with Tyre. But instead, he's forcing into slavery the people who dwelled in the land whose culture would be most likely to penetrate, because they're still having to work that culture out of the land.
Yeah.
And so those would be the people who would be most likely to influence. Like there's just a lot of really not, it doesn't seem like a wise decision here, right? He can conduct things better. And the amount of forced labor that he's going to employ is going to come bite him in the butt later, because people are going to be really annoyed by how he went about things. I don't know.
It's definitely walking a little tripwire. Not
Yeah.
tripwire, but the
Slackline.
yeah.
Tightrope.
Yeah. There's one thing, I don't really have anything to say about this, and we don't have to spend time on it. When it says they were men of war, his servants, his princes, his captains, his chariot commanders, and his horsemen, I think that what's interesting to me here is that all of those are warfare
Like
references,
military, yeah.
whereas Solomon's always been a man of peace.
That's true.
Right?
Now,
So it
the
makes
last-
you... Or, sorry, what were you
The
saying?
last time we saw a king like that, I mean, that's how Saul was.
Yeah. Well, and it also seems like, why does he need them? Like, is he not satisfied with the land he has? Or, like it's almost like where's this story heading? Right? Like, is he multiplying them just to multiply them? Or, like what purpose do these people serve? That's really the question, right? Is he just multiplying horsemen for no reason? Because we know, like once again, I'm just trying to read the Torah into this, right? Because the Torah gives explicit commands, Deuteronomy 17, what a king should do. Don't multiply wives, don't multiply money, don't multiply horses and chariots. And here we see him, okay, it's mentioning horses and chariots again. He now has men for war, servants, princes, captains, chariot, but Solomon, your father was the man of war, right? You were hired, like you were the one to make the temple because you were not a man of war.
Yeah.
So it's almost like there's this lingering question of why, right? Like what is his end goal here? I think that's just the main thing that sticks out to me there.
Yeah, because it's still kind of going through the whole, like, what Solomon's desiring to do, but again, it's like, but why?
Yeah.
Yeah. That makes sense. Because, I mean, he's not fighting Egypt, he has an alliance. Tyre, he has an alliance. I almost want to say that it mentioned, like, even, like, Assyria, or I don't know if Assyria was around, but those countries, I feel like they were vassals.
I mean, a lot. We read that a lot of them were like nearby ones were coming to him, so like that for sure.
There wasn't really no, like, big power to be
Yeah.
multiplying chariots for. These were the chief deputies who were over Solomon's work, 550, who had dominion over the people doing the work. As soon as Pharaoh's daughter came up from the city of David to her house which Solomon had built for her, then he built the Milo. And 3 times in a year Solomon offered burnt offerings and peace offerings on the altar which he built to Yahweh, burning incense with them on the altar which was before Yahweh. So he finished the house. King Solomon also made a fleet of ships in Ezion-Geber, which is near Aloth on the shore of the Red Sea, in the land of Edom. And Hiram sent his servants with the fleet of ships, sailors who knew the sea, along with the servants of Solomon. And they went to Ophir and took from there 420 talents of gold and brought them to King Solomon.
Nice. One thing I'm just going to quote some stuff from the commentary real quick, just because I thought it was interesting what he says about Pharaoh's daughter here and what Solomon built for her. I'll just read a good portion of this.
Okay.
The language of 1 Kings is consistent with the notion that Solomon's creativity is analogous with the creativity of God. The chapter is framed by references to Solomon's finishing the house in verse 1 and 25, employing the clause, he says a thing in Hebrew, I don't need to read it, an echo of Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, right, about like him completing all the work that he had done.
Oh, yeah.
After Solomon plants his own garden, Pharaoh's daughter moves into Jerusalem, like Eve entering into the garden, so that Solomon makes a place for his bride as Yahweh made a place for his. Between his completion of the building and the coming of the bride, Yahweh instructs Solomon about his responsibilities in regard to the house. there's a similar sequence in Genesis chapter 2. The heavens and the earth are finished. Yahweh places Adam in the garden, commands him with regard to the tree of knowledge, and then presents his bride to him. Right? So you have that same flow of thought. In describing his achievements, Solomon is not boasting with ungodly hubris, but fulfilling his potentials of human nature. Humans are created in the image of God, who creates. The humans, therefore, created to be sub-creators. Human making and creativity are not secular concerns in Scripture, but central to humanity's imaging of the transcendent God. So I just wanted to highlight that like there is that kind of parallel. Like the fact that Pharaoh's daughter keeps being brought up here seems significant because we know that Solomon had a bunch of wives, but it keeps bringing up Pharaoh's daughter because it seems like this probably was the first. Well, no, not the first of Solomon's wives, unless Rehoboam was married to somebody who was not Solomon's wife. But because we know Rehoboam was going to be 41 whenever he starts reigning, and Solomon only reigned for 40 years. So Solomon had to get married before he started reigning. But I just wanted to quote that because I thought it was cool.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? Okay, we'll walk through it. These were the chief deputies who were over Solomon's work, 550 who had dominion over the people doing the work. So is this still referring back to like all the other previous projects, or is this more about like what they've been talking about?
I think this is just over all of the work that was just being described in like the previous verses.
That's what I figure.
Yeah.
Because I know that this is like what, second or third time that these chief deputies have been mentioned.
Yeah.
But the numbers are always different, so I'm assuming it's probably different.
Yeah.
Because this is over the course of decades.
Yeah.
And we already talked about this before, but like
also, I just wanted to highlight the word dominion.
Oh yeah.
Just because of the Genesis imagery of,
Yeah.
creation. Okay, sorry.
No, that makes sense. No, I was just saying, like, we already talked about this before, but what does it mean by deputies here? Because whenever we say deputy, we think of like a police officer, like a lieutenant almost, but it's doesn't really seem to be the same kind of usage of the word.
Maybe his chief men, like people that are working for him.
I mean, I guess it kind of explains it in the second half of the verse, because I think we talked about this before. I think the word is used differently based on the different, I think the first time it was more like, they almost seem more like tax collectors or something. Like they would go around and collect the, what do they call it? It was essentially tribute. But it was like there were deputies that like they would rotate producing for King Solomon's house.
Yeah. I think really probably a good just synonym would probably be overseer.
Or like foreman, yeah.
Yeah. It's just like the person who oversees the task that Solomon has for them to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I guess in that sense deputy works, but... As soon as Pharaoh's daughter came up from the city of David to her house, which Solomon had built for her, then he built the Milo. We already talked about that.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think about the verses there. Because, I mean, it's already mentioned her coming up to her house, and it's already mentioned him building the Milo.
Well, I think it's just because it literally said that it's just recapping all the different types of things that he did. And so it talked about...
That's true.
So it talked about Pharaoh conquering Gezer, and then gave it to her as a dowry and stuff like that. And then it talked about, here's all the slaves he had. Now here's the chief deputies. And then as Pharaoh's daughter came up from the city of David to her house, which Solomon built for her. So in addition to the palace, in addition to the temple, he also built a house for her in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Which also is foreshadowing for danger, because he's got foreign wives who are dwelling in Jerusalem, which is going to build trouble for him. Right?
That's true.
The thing that's interesting to me is that it says, like, it tells us when he started building the Milo. Right? As soon as Pharaoh's daughter came up to the house, that's when he started building it. So it's like he started building up the defense walls once she was there. Maybe it could suggest what his mind's on, right? I don't know. Like he's feeling like he's really focused on alliances and preserve. Like he's feeling the need to add defenses, right? Because he's thinking more politically than he is anything else. I don't know. That might be reading too much into it.
But I can definitely see it.
Yeah.
I mean, again, it makes sense from someone who's kind of spiritually lost, that if you're spiritually lost, well, the next best thing is, well, you're the king, you're living in prosperity, just cling on to political pursuits.
Yeah. Which is really ironic given what it's followed by. Because then it immediately follows it up by like, oh no, he's offering offerings to Yahweh. Like you really, I think in this chapter, you really just get the implication that Solomon is a guy who's like in the middle of things, right? Like it's really sad when you go from chapter 8 to this chapter, right? Because, I don't know, it's like, it's almost like you're dealing with two different people, right? Chapter 8, you read the most amazing prayer ever. You get to chapter 9, and you don't understand anything that he's doing, right? All the previous chapters, you were like, I get exactly why Solomon's doing this. This is a wise choice. I understand. Everything in chapter 9, you're like, like,
It's not good.
Again,
like,
it kind of comes back to Saul again, just because like we talked about this a lot with King Saul, at least more so than David and Solomon, even though it technically applies to all of them. But you had said before, the king, like the position of a king, wasn't really ever meant to exist, and so the whole thing with, especially Saul, probably because he was the first king, but was trying to figure out what the heck he's supposed to actually do. And so you saw that in the way he acted. It kind of like some of the things he did didn't really make sense because it was like it seemed like he didn't know what he needed to do, and so it kind of seems like in this chapter he's kind of regressing almost towards like that Saul-like behavior of not knowing exactly what he's supposed to be doing.
which, I mean, and I think that's fair, right? I mean, that doesn't give him an excuse, but I think it just highlights the difficulty of being a king in Israel. Because he is literally reigning as a king over a place that already had a king, right? Yahweh was their king. And it's weird. I was actually talking with Brianne about this, just because I thought this was really cool. I was explaining this passage, like I was explaining Deuteronomy 17 to my students today.
Yeah.
Because we covered like a big chunk of Deuteronomy. And I was talking about, if you think about it, like the beauty of God's plan, right? And I know that we've already gone way over time. It's okay. There's like 4 of us here today. We'll be fine. And hopefully y'all on YouTube are okay with this too. I mean, you can pause this and come back whenever you want. It's okay. Like, the beauty of God's plan here, right? If you can picture it, God is the God over all Israel, right? And then, at some point, the Israelites ask for a king. And so now, God, by his grace, he institutes this role and position that was never supposed to exist, right? And in Deuteronomy, Moses anticipates this is going to happen, right? So it didn't catch God by surprise, but it doesn't change the fact it was never supposed to exist, right? And so now, moving forward in history, you kind of have a dual kingship over Israel. And you have the difficulty of navigating that, right? Like, David did it really well, right? Like, David is like, okay, I'm the king, but God's the real king, right? Like, David made that very clear, right? But David's really the only one who really got that, right? Saul didn't get it. Solomon doesn't really get it. David, he understood, right? But nobody else gets it, right? Everybody else is like, what does it mean to be a king, right? And so for centuries, you've got like this dual kingship going on, right? And you're wondering, how is this solution going to be resolved? Especially because God makes a promise to David that his dynasty is going to last forever. And you're like, okay, well, we can't just get rid of this whole human king thing. So how are we going to redeem this? And this is the beauty of God's plan. Because he is going to have a human king born from the line of David. But that human king is also going to be God in the flesh, right? And so you have these two different kingship roles converging in one man, right? And so it's like how God literally, he brings it back to the original plan while also allowing for human error, right? So God was supposed to be king, and Israel decided they wanted a human king, and God said, okay, I can make that work. I will come in the flesh, and I will be your human king, right? And that's who Jesus is, right? I just think that's really cool. If you just like think it through. I'd never thought about that until today. And as I was explaining it to my students, I was like, that's the beauty of the incarnation. He's truly God, truly man, and it's the only way it works, right? Because God has to be king over Israel. You cannot have just a human king reigning forever. Dominion belongs to God. And so, like, it had to converge somehow. And so the Messiah, if you logically think through it, in order to fulfill the plan of God, he had to be God in the flesh. And I probably need to nuance that more in order to really, like, I'm not, make this a huge thing. Probably shouldn't just put it on the internet the very day that I think of it, but that was a joke. But I don't know, I just think that's really cool. But that's all to back up the point that you're highlighting. Solomon's in a weird spot. He's reigning as a king over a place that was never meant to have a human king. He does not know his job, and that's the difficulty, right? And God doesn't outline it for him, right? God just warns him. He doesn't say, hey, Solomon, here's what you can do to take up your time. He just says, you need to be faithful. Which is kind of nice, because Solomon's basically in the same place we are, right? Because it's not like God outlines to us, hey, I want you to do this, this, and this with your life. Rather, he calls us to be faithful and figure it out. What does God want you to do? I don't know. If he makes it clear to you, go do that. Well, God made it clear to him. He wanted him to build a temple. All right, I can do that. But now Solomon, he might be king, but he's in the same place as all of us. He does not know what he's supposed to do. The issue is he has a lot more pressure on him than any of us ever do. Because he is literally the king over God's people, and we don't even know what the definition of king in Israel is. Because God is king. There's a lot of extra pressure there. That doesn't take away his responsibility, because he's in a leadership role, and those who are in leadership will be judged more strictly. Right?
Yeah.
But I do really empathize with that. I feel bad. I'm like, poor Solomon. I don't envy his position.
Yeah, and the issue is that for us, even if we did get a list of things to do by God, we would just turn into a checklist anyways.
Well, exactly. Yeah.
So then we we just we give ourselves the excuse not to actually rely on our faith at all.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But, okay. And 3 times in a year, Solomon offered burnt offerings and peace offerings on the altar, which he built to Yahweh, burning incense with them on the altar which was before Yahweh. So he finished the house. And so we talked about this last time, but it is interesting seeing that Solomon, he's not acting as a priest, but he is sort of fulfilling priest type role.
Yeah, burning incense.
Not in a sinful way like Saul did, but
Well, yeah, because whenever it says that he offered burnt offerings, I don't think that he's the one, he's not the one conducting the sacrifice. It's the idea that he's bringing it up there and he's following the law like everybody else is.
because if he wouldn't, I think it would definitely mention it, because that was a big deal.
Yeah. And I'm assuming whenever it says 3 times a year, I think that what verse 25 is highlighting here is that, sorry, I just want to check something. Despite the fact that there's so much ambiguity here, we see that Solomon hasn't totally gone astray yet. Right? I think what we see is that we're seeing the cracks in the armor. But he hasn't departed yet. Because when it says that he is going there 3 times a year, I can almost guarantee you that these are the 3 holidays that every male is required to go. Right? This would be Passover, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Tabernacles. Right? So it's Pasach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Right? These are the 3 holidays where every male is required to go offer offerings, and Solomon's doing that. However, there might be some ambiguity even found there. Because the thing is, those are when they're required to come
Yeah.
from all over the land. Solomon literally lives across the street from the temple. So the question is, did he go more than that? Or do we see, is this verse praising Solomon for being a law-abiding citizen? Or is it suggesting that he is no longer the excessive person he once was? Right?
Yeah.
Because, literally the last chapter, and once again, there's nothing wrong with just following the law. You're not required to go over the top. But once again, you see the shift from who Solomon was in chapter 8. In chapter 8, he was giving so many offerings that they stopped counting. Chapter 9, well, he's giving the law's required standard. Okay, that's not bad, but it's not a praise either. You know what I mean? It's saying, God told him to follow the law, he's following the law. God told him to be focused on Yahweh, he's focusing on Yahweh. We haven't seen him stray to other gods yet. But it might be hinting at some more. Right? To where, this isn't inherently bad. What it is good. He's following the law. Good. But it doesn't seem like he's following the law like he used to. Or it doesn't seem like he's going over the top like he used to, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It's not the best thing if he's only going 3 times because he's too busy, he doesn't have time for God because he's doing political stuff.
Yeah. Well, and that's why it's one thing to highlight. It doesn't say only, right?
Yeah.
It says, and 3 times in a year, Solomon offered burnt offerings. Is it only 3 times a year? Or it just meant, I think that the author is trying to be ambiguous here, right? That's what I think the whole goal is, right? To where he's just acknowledging, the only thing he's saying is that he met the standard. Okay, did he go in addition to that, though? Because that's what we would expect of Solomon, but he doesn't mention that. Maybe Solomon did, maybe Solomon didn't. Maybe some years Solomon did, maybe some years Solomon didn't.
Yeah.
Maybe over time Solomon stopped doing it. The one thing he tells us is that 3 times a year he did go do it. So he was at least meeting the letter of the law. The question is, where's the heart behind it, right? Once again, we don't see Solomon reading, we don't hear any words from Solomon this entire chapter. All we see are actions. And there were some times when we saw that with David as well, right? And the actions sometimes spoke louder than the words. And then whenever David speaks, he would actually clarify what was going on inside of his head. I don't know. I just think that's interesting. Like, every detail can be interpreted from different perspectives, right? So I wouldn't be surprised if I went online and looked right now. I didn't even look at how people interpreted this section of the chapter.
Mhm.
But I imagine people would land on different sides here. I don't know. I just think it's interesting.
Yeah, me too. We'll finish up. King Solomon also made a fleet of ships in Ezion Geber, which is near Elath on the shore of the Red Sea, in the land of Edom. And Hiram sent his servants with the fleet of ships, sailors who knew the sea, along with the servants of Solomon. And they went to Ophir and took from there 420 talents of gold and brought them to King Solomon.
Ooh, it's a lot of gold.
Does anyone know where Ophir is?
Pretty sure it's mentioned in Genesis, right?
It's a trick question.
Oh, okay. I was like, I don't know where it's at, but I'm pretty sure it's mentioned in the Genesis account in regards to creation, isn't it?
Oh, maybe.
Isn't it one of those
I looked it
rivers?
up. It only mentioned this account.
Oh, I could be wrong.
Because people, if you look it up, people will come up with all kinds of crazy suggestions for its location. Some people say Arabia, which is pretty reasonable. Some people say Philippines, India, America. Basically, every part of the world, someone has
Oh my gosh.
I think Columbus. I think there's a city in the Americas called Ophir because the gold.
Oh my gosh.
But here, also a fun fact. And I think it's in Beth Horon. They actually discovered some kind of archaeological fragment in like 1946.
Uh-huh.
And so this fragment, it details gold to Beth Horon from Ophir, 30 shekels.
Oh, interesting.
And so that's like, at the very least, it's archaeological evidence that like this was a place where gold was imported.
Yeah. I think it's so funny though that people say it's like America. Like, guys, like, come
Yeah.
on. Like, every other location mentioned here is like in the nearby vicinity of the, like,
Yeah. It was like Sri Lanka.
like even to
India.
suggest like Italy or something. Like, I'd be like, no, that's ridiculous. Like,
Yeah.
I think we're dealing with Middle Eastern stuff, right? Like, what?
I was like, the Arabia, maybe. I mean, there's probably plenty of gold over
Yeah.
there. But, like,
Yeah.
I mean, Sri Lanka, India, that's a stretch.
Yeah.
Philippines, no.
So I know why I thought Ophir was mentioned in Genesis. Is because the only other place Ophir is mentioned is in Genesis chapter 10. And it's mentioned alongside Havilah, which is mentioned in Genesis chapter 2. In the creation account.
I got
Right?
you.
And I remember because it says, the name of the first is the Pishon, like the river.
Yeah.
It is the one that went around the whole land of Havilah where there is gold.
Gold. Yeah.
Right? And so I remembered Havilah being associated with gold. And then Havilah is mentioned in Genesis chapter 10, which is mentioned alongside Ophir. So that's
I didn't know it was in Genesis 10.
boom. I knew that for some reason I associated with Genesis chapter 2. It was like the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon or whatever. Yeah. So they went to Ophir. Fun fact about verses 26 to 28, this is the first time we ever hear about an Israelite sailing.
Makes sense.
It doesn't, I don't, there's no application points for that. I just thought I'd mention it.
Well,
He made a fleet of ships. Cool. Israelites weren't really seafaring people.
yeah.
They kind of viewed the sea as like the scary chaos waters where like the devil lives, basically. And they're like, yeah, we stay away from that.
I mean, fair enough. The sea is pretty scary.
Well, yeah, I mean, like, if you think about it, I don't know if you ever noticed this. Anytime somebody's out on the sea in the Bible, it's a scary scene.
Joe.
Like yeah, Jonah, the disciples,
Yeah.
Paul. Like, anytime there's water involved, things don't go well, right? The only way to go, safely through waters is if the waters part for you. Like, that's the only way to go through waters. But
That's funny. Yeah. That's part of the reason I asked about the Deuteronomy thing earlier is I wasn't sure if there was anything in the Torah about, like, against, like, building ships or anything.
I don't think so.
I didn't see
Solomon's
anything
going
there.
above and beyond.
Yeah, just because I was like trying to think like what the heart would be behind expanding to a navy, because I'm trying to think again. you can justify it. Maybe you want to defend against people, but again, like, why? You're in peace,
Yeah.
and so I'm not sure what the heart would be behind building a navy.
Yeah, I think all of this just adds more to the ambiguity. Solomon is a guy without purpose. Like that's really what this whole story is about. It's like he's doing things, and in previous chapters we knew why he was doing them, right? He was either making political alliances or he was getting stuff for the temple. Here he is simply doing things for the sake of doing things, right? It's literally just a laundry list of stuff he did, and I think that's probably the issue, right? He doesn't seem to have a purpose or end goal that's readily apparent. It's just he just did it. He made a fleet because he could.
Yeah.
Yeah, which I don't think the Torah had to, like, I think this is probably one of those things that the Torah didn't prohibit, but it didn't have to, right? Because why would he need this, you know?
Yeah.
Like, he really doesn't. I think it's just, yeah.
Yeah. That makes sense. Do y'all have anything else?
I think we're probably good to go.
It's a lot of ships, I'd say, though.
Well, we've already talked about some application points, but I mean, we've already gone over. But is there anything, any thoughts you'll have as far as like application or really just anything? It doesn't have to be application, but any closing thoughts or application that y'all might have that we didn't talk about or that you want to like expand upon?
I think last week we said application was like, be like Solomon. I think this chapter, don't be like Solomon.
Don't be like
Like,
Solomon.
it's like, I don't know, just, I mean, I think the application point, like just in broad scope, we need to learn to be faithful even whenever there's not a clear calling
Yes.
that God's given us, right? Because a lot of times people talk about waiting on the Lord for like a clear calling. We're not guaranteed that, right? Even if you are the king of Israel, you are not guaranteed to be given a clear outline of what you're called to do, right? What we're called to do is learn to be faithful no matter where we're at, right? Whether you're a king, whether you are working on eyes, whether you're a teacher, whether you're working at a grocery store, your call is simply to be faithful, right? That's what all of us are called to do, and that's the issue with Solomon here, right? He is being a king, but he's being more of a king than he is being a follower of Yahweh, right? And that's going to be his downfall. Right? He's putting his position before his actual calling. And that's what God warned him about. Right? So I think that application point, we need to figure out, are we being faithful? Right? That's really the question. Right? I think the question is less, what am I being called to do with my life? And more, am I being faithful in the moment? Right? That's really what you need to ask every morning when you wake up. How am I going to be faithful today? Right? We don't need to, I think we need to get rid of the idea of like us being called like these like super huge tasks unless God makes that clear, right? Really, we just need to be satisfied with being faithful day by day.
I mean, you might know your calling and you could still be unfaithful.
Yeah,
Yep.
So even then, that may not mean a whole lot.
yeah. Or you so hyper fixate on the calling that you actually miss the point of the calling.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Just, I mean, if you want to even bring it back to this, I mean, it wasn't per se his calling, but again, it could be easy to like fill that void with just like building stuff and making things. Like it's almost like a faux sense of like faithfulness, I guess.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Yep.
Could someone pray us out?
Lord, we thank you for this time that you've given us, and we thank you for the freedom of allowing us to gather together. God, I pray that as we leave this study, that we can think about all the things that we talked about today, and all the application points that you brought up, and that similar to the song "Come Thou Fount," we can realize that our hearts are prone to wonder, and they're prone to leave the God that we love. It's in your name we pray. Amen.
Right.